we could clone a human.
I'm not clear as to why it is a bad idea to go find the smartest person that's ever lived and take their DNA and try to recreate that over and over and over again so that we can solve some of our hardest problems.
I think intelligence, we have a difficulty talking about it because we don't want to admit a big part of it's inherited.
There's one person 1,000 years that will be known that lives today.
Satoshi?
No. Many parents look at school as almost like a babysitter.
That's why I'm a fan of child labor.
Child labor?
Yes.
All right, explain this. Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, I think we're going to see some really wild shit in the near future. We could potentially be living in the most important century in history. And that changes everything about what you think is important to work on.
All right, guys, I'm here with Dwarkesh. I'm very excited about this conversation. I thought a great place to start would be around artificial intelligence, but not from maybe the perspective most people have. You said something to me recently that just stuck with me, which is the problems that computers have are actually some of the easiest things for human brains to do, and vice versa. Some of the hardest problems for human brains are actually the easiest things for computers to do. Explain that a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited about this. That's such an interesting thing if you look at the things that AIs are really good at. And this is changing a little bit, to be fair. If you think of like calculating like 10-digit numbers, computers can do that in like nanoseconds, literally. If you think about just some stuff that like babies can do, right? Like recognizing faces, grammar. Like if you think about Chomsky's universal grammar stuff, just like how sentences are strung together in a way. It's really hard to like actually set up rules that computers can understand about parsing grammar trees. That's something, again, babies can do. So it's really interesting. But this is changing. I don't know if you've seen like the DALL-E to the GPT-3. These like the GPT-3 is like actually producing essays. Like it writes essays better than probably most of the people in my college. DALL-E is generating art that's like really fucking cool. And so these are things you would think that, oh no, these are the things that are like humans' expertise and the calculations we can export to the computers. So I'm not sure which way this is trending now because, yeah.
Is the problem that the computers can do the really tough calculations, but they can't do things like facial recognition, something where we haven't had enough technology innovation, and eventually the computer will be able to do both the calculations and also what a human can do?
I would think so, right? Because, well, it's really mysterious because if you think about, it sounds impressive to say, you can do all these calculations, but if you think about it from a computer architecture point of view, it's like a few gates to actually do these, like integer addition, multiplication. This is like trivial stuff in terms of like how much actual computational hardware is needed. Whereas like recognizing a face, I mean, just think about like writing a program to do that directly. You had to train these like huge neural nets to be able to do that. So it's actually kind of mysterious that our brain didn't just like add a little faculty that's like, we would add big numbers. But I guess we just never had the evolutionary pressure to need that capacity. But yeah, I would think eventually if our brains can do it, and our brains are physical hardware, why can't we build artificial physical hardware that does the same thing our brains can do? And it can do everything we can do.
It feels like when we are building the software and hardware to be able to do this stuff, but we have to break down so much of what the brain does into math and science for the computer to be able to actually execute it. So if you look at facial recognition, like a lot of the facial recognition systems, they just use 12 points on a face, and that's what they're doing. So it's less about some sort of arbitrary, like that's a face, that's not a face, this face is person A, this face is person B, and it's much more mathematical, right?
Yeah.
It's literally looking at, sometimes 12 points, sometimes more, sometimes less, to try to get to the granularity of how does the computer actually recognize this is the person that it's looking for, this is the item. There has to be something that fits within the framework of math, right, for the computer to be able to do it. Because at the end of the day, like the computer is a math system.
Right. This is one of the interesting things difference between like Tesla and I don't know if you've like heard of Comma AI. This is like George Hotz's startup. So like the difficulty with self-driving is you had to account for all these edge cases, right? Like you can't have a self-driving car that's like able to do everything, but like it'll run over a child.
99% accuracy is really bad.
99% of the time it'll hit the child. So then you have to deal with all these edge cases, which makes it really difficult. Like if the computer you've like hard coded in like the lane lines and everything, but you haven't like gotten to not killing the grandma, you're fucked.
Is this why Tesla has such an advantage? Because they have every single Tesla on the road collecting so much data and it ultimately is just a data problem? Or is there other ways to look at it?
I'm actually not sure about this, but I think another interesting thing Tesla does is there's this great guy who has a blog about engineering, Austin Vernon, and he was writing about Tesla. One of the interesting things he pointed out is you look at the way Elon Musk thinks about problems of manufacturing. They've built like this amazing manufacturing machine, and it's really difficult to do that, right? Like they've got a bigger market cap than all the other automakers in the US combined. Like there was something about adding fluff in the top of the cars to make sure that the whole thing was insulated. And then, it was just like adding so much overhead to the manufacturing because robots can't pick up this fluff. And then Elon just asked, like, do we really need this? Let's just run some experiments. Like, does it actually add insulation? And they realize, no, it doesn't. So just simplifying the whole process so it can be manufactured fast and efficiently and reliably and precisely. I think there's a lot of interesting things Tesla is doing.
Elon obviously didn't start out with ambitions in the 90s to build a car company. He didn't start out trying to say, hey, I want to go to Mars or create rockets. But he does have this apparent skill from a first principles thinking and kind of a framework. How important is it that Elon didn't come from those industries to, if he had been a rocket scientist or he had been a car manufacturer and had grown up in, the Ford kind of executive program, like would he have been able to do this or did it take an outsider? Yeah,
that's such an interesting question. Because there's like aerospace was such a stagnant sector for so long. And so but that's what it takes, right? Like Elon comes from software, obviously. He founded X.com, which became PayPal. And the whole scheme about software is we want to scale this as fast as possible. We want to make this as cheap as possible. We want the most amount of people to use it. Maybe that mentality just hadn't pervaded these engineering disciplines. And so just that attitude he had maybe was the thing that was most important. Because like the difference between SpaceX and what came before it is like huge. It cost $20,000 per kilogram to send things to space in the 1990s, I believe. And Elon brought that down to 2,000. That's an order of magnitude difference. Like those kinds of differences. Space travel has been around for decades before then. And you can still bring it down in order of magnitude. That's like amazing.
Yeah. And it feels like once he broke through, right, and kind of the tech innovation happened, now everyone is like, oh, we have all these different ideas. We have smaller rockets. We have people doing space tourism. Like it was almost kind of the Roger Bannister 4-minute mile. Everyone thought about it the second that one person did it. Then a bunch of people went and ran the 4-minute mile. And it feels like Elon kind of did that a little bit with space exploration.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Jimmy Stoney has a great book about the PayPal Mafia. People like Peter Thiel, Max Levchin, obviously Elon Musk, about how they founded this company and how they went on to found all kinds of other companies, YouTube, LinkedIn. This all comes out of the PayPal Mafia. And one of the interesting hypotheses you can develop about why is it the case that PayPal, this one company, led to a whole bunch of other companies in the form of the founders exited, then they just built basically half of Silicon Valley. And now with obviously Elon, most of car manufacturing, most of the space industry. So why was this group of people such prolific founders? And one interesting hypothesis is, maybe it was the fact that PayPal wasn't that successful, in the sense that when they exited, eBay bought them for I think $1 billion, which is a good sum of money. But it's not like we got about over $50 billion. And so these people who were super ambitious, they did have enough money to fund their next businesses, but it wasn't enough for them to feel complacent,
Yeah. Well, it's also most young founders. We always point when we think of young founders, we think of Mark Zuckerberg or whatever. But the average age of a successful entrepreneur in America is early 40s. Right. So you have experience, you have capital, you have network, you have connections, all these different things. But also, usually people build their biggest companies not as the first one. And so PayPal, right? Yeah. PayPal wasn't even actually Elon Musk's first company. But if you think about it,
he had Zip2,
kind of in some way, you have almost practice. So he does Zip2, then he does PayPal, right? And then all of a sudden, by the time you get to the third, fourth, fifth one, you know the playbook, you've got the reputation, you've got access to capital, you can attract talent, which is incredibly important.
Yeah.
And you also have a shit ton of experience.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I mean, the thing with PayPal that's interesting is that Elon, he got kicked out of PayPal by Peter Thiel and others. But one of the reasons was he had just amazing expectations for the company could do. He literally wanted to remake the financial system, right? And if you go see what he's done afterwards, in every industry he goes into, he just basically does it from scratch, like takes it to an order of magnitude improvement. And, maybe that's the thing about like founders who end up being more successful in their first business than Elon was with like PayPal. Let's say they hit it big, but it's like social networking or something like that. Maybe we're missing out on a lot of talent that could be going to like hard tech, bio space, those kinds of things. But they're just like, they didn't have like a middling exit. They just kept, they had like a multi-billion-dollar company, which is like great. But if it's somebody like Elon, they could like remake entire sectors of the economy. Maybe these people should, I don't know, like be forced to quit at some point. They're first startups.
I do think there's a level of boldness that it takes to build really, really big companies. And in some way, the easier path was like go build like an ad optimization, software. You could tell people you wanted to take it public, but like you were hoping that Google or Facebook was going to come in and buy it for $400 or $500 million, maybe $1 billion, and like amazing.
Yeah.
But at some point, people stop caring about like the exit value, and I think that's when they say like, what could we really accomplish? Right. And that's where like the boldness comes in. Now it's weird because people who find success, some people actually lose the ambition. They lose like the edge. And so you do get a bifurcation. Like after somebody has had a successful exit of any material size, they either become hyper ambitious and go take on crazy stuff. Brian Johnson with Kernel, he sold Braintree. I think he sold it for like $800 million or something. And then he was like, I want to go solve this like brain-computer interface problem. And he completely dedicated, his time to doing that. I think he's the biggest investor in the company, put a ton of money into it, and obviously went the hyper-ambitious path. But then there's folks who like, I'm gonna go to the beach, right? And so it feels like that is a fork in the road for a lot of entrepreneurs is once they've tasted some level of success, you kind of find out like who's in it for the game and who is in it for the money.
Dude, it's so hilarious when you hear people talk about engineers or founders who have been really successful in the past. And when they talk about what problem they want to solve, they literally just start from like first principles. What is literally the most important thing I could work on? It's not even a factor to them like how implausible does this sound? Like John Carmack had a great episode on Lex recently. John Carmack, by the way, is like this legendary programmer, probably the greatest of all time, created Doom, these other games. So he's talking about like, once I was done with all this game development stuff, I was considering what should I do next. And I thought, nuclear fission is an important problem. AGI is an important problem, like artificial general intelligence. So these are the hardest things a human being could like endeavor to do, right? And he's just like, yeah, that's one possibility I could work on. That's one thing about some of these people who actually do become more ambitious afterwards is that instead of just looking at how they can make the most money, they're literally just start from complete first principles. What is the most important thing I could work on? Sam Altman, the former CEO of Y Combinator, is another interesting example of this. He's, I think, only in his 30s, but like right now, he's the CEO of OpenAI, which is like the company that's releasing all these crazy fucking models that are changing the AI industry. He's also helping Helion build fusion. So that's like not fission. This is like a completely different thing. They're trying to make energy 10x cheaper than it is now. Just like working on the two hardest problems you could possibly be working on at the same time. It's kind of interesting when those kinds of people come around.
Will we have a return back to that being the aspiration of a lot of founders? Like, did the pendulum swing, do you think, too much to like the social media, consumer product, ad optimization kind of end of the spectrum? And now we're seeing a pendulum swing back to things like Anduril, Varda, a number of businesses like this. Hey, Hadrian, we can just go down the line. There's a bunch of them. Like, is the pendulum swinging back?
Interesting. Well, I don't know if you've heard this about China, but one of the interesting theories I heard about what they're up to is that, they're cracking down on these like big tech companies in China, like Alibaba, who knows where Jack Ma is right now. And so the question is, like, what are they up to? And one interesting theory I heard is they realize that the future is in large part going to be controlled by whoever controls hard tech, right? Mm-hmm. Who is making the advancements? Obviously, AI is part of like, I guess, the more computer science aspect of it, but also other things like energy, who's controlling bio, right? And they don't even have the same like sense of what is correct morally with regards to like bioenhancement and things like that. So whoever controls those industries is going to control the future. And one of the interesting theories I heard about this is maybe their idea is we're going to like crack down on people going into programming and software and make them like almost force them to go into like these hardware tracks that are going to be super important in the future.
Well, you see this in their geopolitical strategy as well. Like they definitely have run around the world and tried to create financing advantages where they go to a country, specifically they've been doing this to a lot of African nations and say, hey, we're going to provide you a loan on some, interesting terms. And it happens to be for your port, right? Or for some kind of critical infrastructure. And because we're the financier of it, it gives them incredible leverage or access or information into that hardware, right? Which we don't think of the same way as we think of maybe like a computer, but like what's more important? Is it to be the hardware manufacturer for the next great, desktop computer? Or is it more important to have a specific advantage in very strategic ports around the world?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question because since World War II, basically the U.S. has been the hegemonic naval power. It's basically said to the rest of the world, like, we'll protect the seas for you, but you're kind of part of our empire. Like, you're our bitch, basically, right? And then, China is like trying to turn that around. I happen to think, I haven't looked too much into this, but I happen to think that that's probably a good thing for the countries they're going into. Like people talk about it as like exploitative or something. And part of it probably is, but also like getting money on terms, getting loans on terms that the rest of the world is not willing to offer to you. Assuming you have good leadership that's like not just going to squander the money and then your future country's left in a bunch of debt. Yeah, it's like I think that's probably a good thing.
So like basically you're saying it could be, and again, we got to see it play out, but it could be good for the country, bad for the US in some way.
Yeah. Who is that? What is the name of that Japanese like crazy motherfucker who's the venture capitalist?
Masayoshi Son.
Yeah. I wonder if like China is a Masayoshi Son of Africa. It's just like throwing crazy money after. If
you create your own money, like why not?
I saw this hilarious tweet that was like, there's never been a greater Marxist redistribution effort than $100 billion of Saudi oil money going to Masayoshi Son, who just gives it to like these stupid ideas about, we're going to like do pet delivery in Antarctica or, just like the craziest ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how much of it is you have to fund the dumb ideas to get the breakthroughs as well? Like, when Elon shows up and says, I'm going to build a reusable rocket, a lot of people weren't like, hey, here's money, right? He wasn't Elon at the time, but also there was a hard tech component to it, and I think an aspirational goal that is different than like food delivery or pet walking or whatever. But still, it feels like you gotta do quite stupid deals to get some of the breakthroughs, right? Like Airbnb is a good example where, if you're investing in two guys who are like, we're renting out air mattresses in our kitchen, a lot of folks would have been like, that's dumb. But then it's followed up years later and a bunch of venture capitalists funded like, remember Juicero?
No.
It was like make juice at home, kind of like a coffee machine, but for juice. And I forget, it raised an ungodly amount of money. And so, of course, when it didn't work, all of the critics of the tech industry and of Silicon Valley were like, look at these idiotic tech bros funding, a juice machine. Why do you need, $100 million or $200 million, whatever it was? But it was like, sure, but you would have said the same thing about Airbnb if it didn't work.
Yes.
And so like it's important that they work because then people look like geniuses, the founders, the investors.
Right.
If they don't work, then the critics get ammunition and they're like, you guys are morons.
I'd be actually curious about your perspective on this because you actually did invest in Airbnb.
What's up, guys? I hope you're enjoying this conversation. Dwarkesh has an awesome podcast called The Lunar Society. You guys should definitely go into the description. You can subscribe there both on YouTube and to the audio. All right, let's get back into the conversation, and I hope you guys enjoy it.
One thing I've been wondering about is, if you think about like the stock market versus venture capital, right? The great thing, like the reason I expect stock prices to be like generally correct is you can short a stock. So if it's like too highly valued, somebody will come in and like short it and so it'll come to its correct fundamental value. With venture capital, there's like, let's say you think that the marginal venture capitalist is making a stupid deal, right? Like you think that this company is super overvalued. There's no way for you to short it and reduce its price to its correct value. So it's like asymmetric in that way. Prices can only increase. It's similar to like housing markets where you can say like, I think SF's like house prices maybe in 2020 are like, I think they're overvalued, right? But there's no way for you to like make profit off that knowledge. And so, yeah, the market doesn't correct as easily. Would you say that's like a correct characterization of how the VC industry works?
So there's correction mechanisms, but they're done in a different way, right? So public stock, let's say that I'm long, it gets overvalued. You're like, hey, it's overvalued. You can short it. And the theory is that it finds kind of the equilibrium price of the market over time. In venture capital, because it's private and illiquid, people can invest on specific terms, and we've seen it over the last 8-9 months. There can be corrections in the market where companies that raised money at huge valuations that maybe didn't have the financial performance or the growth kind of track record that fit those numbers from the end of 2021. The next round of funding, somebody may come in and say, hey, I don't think it's worth, $2 billion, I think it's worth $1 billion. And so there's down rounds, but it's not done in the same way of like somebody is necessarily profiting off of the cut in valuation from $2 billion to $1 billion. Yeah. It's instead that the people who actually are affected, they're affected negatively. It's either the investors who are investing at $2 billion, it's shareholders that were already equity holders of the business, and then employees. Mm-hmm. Right, who thought that, hey, our equity's worth $2 billion or whatever. Right. Now, actually, it's only worth $1 billion. And so it's a correcting mechanism, but because there is no liquid market, there's no shorting mechanism, which is like an interesting, kind of alteration to eventually trying to figure out what is the market price.
I've got a few friends who work at startups, and obviously given the market, basically a lot of their wealth is just in the equity that the startup is giving them. And at this point, it's like, not only is it liquid, but if they sold it in private markets, it would just be worth a lot less. So, they're just like sitting, like basically they're like illiquid for the next few years until like their companies go public or like the market changes or something.
I was talking to a friend recently and he basically was like, I've been trying to figure out how many of my friends made money in tech. I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, think about it. He was like, we happen to know a very wide spectrum of folks. We know people who have been working in the technology industry for a decade plus, and they've made no money. And then we happen to be friends with or know folks who are the single best investors in the world, and they've made an absolute killing. But if you were to look at the full aperture of the folks we know in the technology industry, most of them have not made life-changing money compared to the ones who have. Now, the ones who have are well-known, and it has been explosive, profits. And so the power law takes over, and those are the people who everyone points to and goes, oh, look how much money you can make in tech. But it probably, from an individual participation standpoint, follows a lot of the distributions like venture funds. It's like, I don't forget the exact numbers, but like 50% of venture funds don't make any money. Yeah. And so if you were to just bring that to employees, like what percentage of employees in the tech industry don't make enough money to retire? More than 50%, like they're still working, right? And so you start to understand it's just like everything else. Like there are people who win, there are people who lose, and everyone points to the extremes. But the actual experience of the everyday kind of average participant in the market is not what the extreme is. And so people forget that because they're holding equity. But I think we've seen over the last 9 months, like the correction in the market shows them maybe I didn't have as much value of this equity that I thought I had.
Yeah. And I think people also overestimate the upside of like working at a startup, not necessarily founding a startup, but working at a startup. Like if you think about, let's say you get on board a startup that is gonna grow like gangbusters. I mean, the first challenge is like you basically have to think like an investor to like even figure out what startup you want to work in.
Yes,
because what they're paying you in is equity, and how you value that equity is the same way an investor would value that equity, right? So you had to have that skill in the first place, which is like you had to be a great programmer and you had to know how to value startups in the market. Okay, so you need both those skills. Let's say you have those skills. Okay, and then you're an early employee at a startup. They give you like 0.5% equity or something. Even if you get that, and even if the company exits for like $1 billion, right? Which is like not going to happen, like a rare kind of thing, a unicorn. Everybody's heard of these companies. So even if you happen to like pick that, then you still exit with like 0.5% equity. You only get $5 million at exit. Whereas if you're that good a programmer or that good an engineer, you could have just like worked for Google for 10 years for the same amount of time it would have taken that exit, and you could have made like a similar amount of money. So
or more.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually an interesting problem I've heard startup founders talk about, which is given how much money was flowing around these markets for the last few years. One interesting challenge is like, listen, you want to hire a second employee, a third employee. These people are not going to have like the amount of equity that the founders have. So they're obviously going to be like less motivated to get on board your company. But like with your third employee, you basically need him to be like a founder quality person, right? You can't just have like some guy who's does his 8 to 5 as a third employee or something. But these people are not going to get the equity that you're getting. So if this person is good enough to start a startup, otherwise you shouldn't hire them. So if they're good enough to start a startup, why wouldn't they just like raise their own money to build their own startup?
This goes back to a lot of the first 5 employees. They take founder risk without founder reward, right? Yeah. And what I found is the people who are the best second, third, fourth, fifth hire, they know that they're actually not going to go start a company. So they tend to be younger people who are saying, I want to learn, and then eventually one day I'll go start my own company. So it's almost like a apprenticeship / workhorse, right? And then the second thing I would say is a lot of the best startups in the world, they basically hired their friends. Right. If you really think, I did an interview with David Sachs and I asked him about PayPal and the PayPal Mafia.
Yeah.
And I was like, how did you get all of these people? And he's like, well, no one wanted to work for us, so we just hired our friends.
Yeah.
And it just happened to be they were all, these amazing folks. And so I do think in hindsight, we like to tell these like really sexy stories about like, I knew that person was going to go on and found, an amazing company, and it happened to be Chad Hurley who did YouTube.
Yeah.
And then you find out you're like, no, like literally we needed somebody to program, and like we found the smartest person we could who would come work for us, and like it happened to be this person.
Yeah.
And then they went on and did something amazing.
Yeah.
And so you have to be careful as to like the hindsight bias of it looks amazing, but there is a kernel of truth of like Max Levchin, Elon Musk, and Peter Thiel, who are pretty much the people making the hiring decisions very early on. They were great at selecting talent, right? And that talent just happened to then go start companies, and everyone recognized them later on. But these 3 fellows understood it, on day one.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question of how you spot this talent. This is like something I've been trying to think about from like initially from the perspective of somebody who was like trying to get opportunities, like in college, trying to figure out, how can I get spotted and stuff like that. But I think this is one of the really interesting challenges of how you spot people who have talent. But not only that, you spot people who others haven't already spotted. So you're just like going to go to like the Harvard job fair, like people know these guys are smart, right? So, like everybody else will be there. You want to spot the people other people don't know could be as valuable as you think. Like just with the PayPal Mafia people, like Joe Lonsdale, wasn't he like just a Stanford student? They got him on an internship, stuff like that. Yeah. So
but I think the Harvard job fair is the last place to go look for talent.
Yeah.
Especially in startups, because if you are at the Harvard job fair, you're looking for a job. Right? Like that's why you're there, right? And so to some degree, like actually the better thing to do is to go to the Harvard computer science lab on Friday night at 11 p.m. and see who's there.
Didn't PayPal actually kind of do, not with Harvard, I think with like another university?
I'm sure they did.
I think they basically did something very similar.
Yeah. And I think a huge piece of this is like you're looking for the person who's already doing the job or who already shows a predisposition to being successful in this environment, not the person who is showing up and looking for how big is your organization? If I put it on my resume, will it look good? How much do I get paid? What's my title? Like it's just playing a different game. And so what you want is people who are worried about the end result, not kind of what it looks like you're doing.
Yeah.
I always think of this as like the parent test. Are you hiring somebody who cares what their parents think about their job? Or are you hiring somebody who wants to be able to say to their parents 10 years from now, that thing that you use every day? My team and I built that. And those are 2 different people, right? Like there are some people who it's really important that their parents can say to their friends, like, my kid does X, or my kid is a lawyer or a doctor or has this big title at some company.
Yeah.
Probably not for, building innovative technology.
Yeah, no, I think what you said there is really fundamental. I was trying to figure out, Cal Newport has this really interesting blog post where he points out, like you can think of you can like, let's say you can reverse this back to college admissions just to get a sense of how to think about talent. So if you think about a kid in high school, right? One of the kids he's like started a business. Maybe he has like 5-figure cash flow. He might even have like a few contract employees. Like, I don't know, he builds websites or, just like doing something. And then you have a kid who's like the president of 5 clubs and he's on the varsity tennis team and he's, I don't know, like volunteered in Ethiopia over summer. He got a selfie with a shovel. So you think about those 2 people. Why is it the first one sounds more impressive? It's not because he worked harder, because to be a president in like 5 clubs or whatever, you got to work pretty hard. Maybe it's not even necessarily he's more intelligent, right? Like, again, you still have to be pretty intelligent to like excel in high school, get all these great SAT scores, whatever. So what is the difference? And he says it has something to do with novelty, that the first kid, the one who's like started this business, he's doing something original, creative, shows that he has a vision, ambition. I think that's part of it, but I think there's something even more fundamental. If you think about how a call option is valued, right? Like call option being the right to buy something, the right to buy a stock at a predetermined price. So you're basically trying to maximize the upside. If you think about how a call option is valued, what do you care about? Well, you care about the volatility, right? If you have a call option on a stock, you might even care more about the volatility than its actual current value or its expected value. Because if the stock is moving around all the time in huge, then there's a chance it'll like move up. Like you think about like buying a call option on Bitcoin, right? In like 2015 or something. You just care about the Bitcoin being super volatile. Because if it goes to the moon, you have all that upside. And you also want a big time to maturity. So the distance between like where your current date and like when the call option is exercised. Again, because there's more room for the underlying asset to experience large fluctuations in value. You apply that to talent. You think about the kid who is starting a business in high school. That guy is like way more volatile, right? So buying an option on him is like buying an option on Tesla. Buying an option on the second kid is like buying an option on IBM. It's just like how far up it's going to go, right? Like the first kid could potentially become the next Patrick Collison. The second kid might work for Patrick Collison.
Well, it also goes back to like, in some way you have to pick the people that violate the societal conformism, right? Like the more that somebody is conforming to what society thinks you should do, the less likely they are to have volatility, right? Or to have the outlier components or kind of outcomes. And so if you go back and you look at a hell of a lot of people who have ended up being highly successful, they sure didn't fit kind of the normal box. Now you have to be careful because some people are just weird, right? Or dumb and their ideas literally sound insane because they are insane. But there's a lot of folks who are outside of kind of that normal framework, and that's where the volatility lies. And so with volatility, it works both directions. It can go up, but it can go down as well. And so to some degree, if you're playing a power law game, which venture capital is, you actually should go make almost all of your bets on highly volatile kind of opportunities because you only need one, right? Which, again, sounds to the untrained person, oh, you're gambling. But no, it's you're understanding the power law, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to find the highest volatility you can find. And if you pick correctly, you end up hitting more and more and more.
There was this great movie, Hindi movie that it's one of my favorites. It's called Once Upon a Time in Mumbai. And it's basically about this like mafia boss. And so then he's like testing out this new recruit. And the guy is just like, he's just like a crook, the new guy, but he's also like really ambitious and really creative. And then, so then he recruits him. And one of his like, I don't know, it's like, basically it's like the mafia boss's like chief of staff is like, that guy doesn't seem straight. That guy seems like all kinds of wicked. And the mafia boss is like, well, we have no room. We have no need for straight people in our business. But the dangerous thing is, yes, you want to take these leveraged bets on people. The thing about leverage, you can think of like a 10x engineer as not just meaning he's like 10x better, but like apply the literal financial definition. So you have like a 3x S&P fund. You can have like 10x levered Tesla. Think about it as like actual financial leverage. That's not always good, right? It's good if you have, if you've made a great bet. If you made a great bet on like a company you're really sure about your vision, leverage can amplify your returns. But if you've made the wrong bet, you're just going to get liquidated faster. Think about like somebody like Napoleon. So if after the revolution, the government in charge of France was a directory, and they made a highly leveraged bet in the person of Napoleon, right? So he gave them stupendous returns. Austria, Italy, even like went to Egypt, like fought under the shadows of the pyramids. But it was a leveraged bet. There's a big downside, one of which is he'll return and he'll get rid of the entire government and replace it with his own dictatorship. But what kind of person did you think was going to be the one that's going to conquer all of Europe for you? So yeah, I think it's like really potentially rewarding, but potentially very dangerous to hire those kinds of people.
Elon said this on SNL. He was like, I'm trying to like save humanity and go to Mars. Like, did you think I'd be normal? Right? Like, I thought that was like that's the most honest thing that I think anyone could say on national television. Yeah. It's like, no, we shouldn't think that you're normal. And that's why you think that, I saw a clip recently. His birthday is exactly 69 days after 420. And he was like, this is a simulation, right? And it's like, of course, this guy thinks it's hilarious, right? So I don't know. It's a very weird thing. You wrote a piece about miracle years, and I found this fascinating, where a number of great scientists and inventors, they basically had majority of their breakthroughs in a very compressed period of their career. Describe a little bit this idea of like miracle years, and then like, why do you think this is something that plays out?
No, it's such an interesting, it's such an interesting pattern. Yeah, that piece went like super viral, more than I was expecting. But it was just one of these interesting patterns you notice in the world. And once you notice them, you can start thinking. It makes you maybe shift your perspective on certain things, maybe come up with entire different theories about how to explain different institutions. But yeah, so this is a really interesting pattern in the careers of scientists, not only scientists, but especially scientists. You see somebody like Isaac Newton, age of 21, pandemic hits Oxford, he's sent home, comes up with theory of gravity, calculus, starts making progress towards optics. It's said that, by the way, he created calculus at the same pace that a college student learns calculus.
Wow.
Yeah. All in 1 year at the age of 21. Einstein, age of 26, he's like PhD kind of got rejected. He's been sidelined out of an academic career. So he's a patent clerk. As a patent clerk, he comes up with, he explains the photoelectric effect, comes up with special relativity, Brownian motion. There was another important paper, I think it was about Avogadro's constant. But anyways, 4 fundamental results, like super important results in the history of science. 26, 1 year. And it's not just science. I mean, there's other scientists who've had such miracle years, von Neumann, Gauss, Euler. But you look at the careers, I don't know if you saw the Brandon Sanderson thing.
I did not.
Okay, well, do you know who, like he's a fantasy author, probably the biggest fantasy author these days. He, since the pandemic started like 2 years ago, he announced on YouTube he's written 5 extra novels that his fans didn't know he was writing, in addition to the ones they already knew he was writing. The Kickstarter to access these novels, he's releasing them as a Kickstarter, $40 million.
Wow.
Biggest Kickstarter in history. Okay, anyways, so what is happening here? Why are these people having these extraordinary years where they make progress towards seemingly independent problems in such a short span of time? There's a lot of interesting hypotheses here. One is maybe there's like a brief window in a person's life where they're young enough to have creativity, intelligence, your intelligence kind of declines as you get older, ambition, but also they're like mature enough to kind of understand what's going on in the field. It's similar to what you said with Elon going into these new fields, applying first principles thinking. So maybe there's like a brief window in a person's life where they can do that. And maybe it's like only a couple years in your entire life, right? And if those years you're concentrated, you're able to work on the problem, you're gonna make a shit ton of progress. There's other hypotheses you could make. Like one is maybe just like a super sad story about, let's say you become successful, right? Let's say you win a Nobel Prize. Let's say you become department head or something. Okay, what does that mean? Well, you got like a bunch of obligations that are sucking away your time, your energy. You got to like attend conferences, write pop sci books, just like do interviews, like deal with, if you're a department head, you got to do all this administrative stuff. And that's one thing where like maybe our universities are really fucking up, because like maybe even like now the grad students are getting mired up in all this like extracurricular duties. So one thing is just like your success brings obligations that like destroy your capacity to do productive work. And yeah, there's a few other interesting one thing is that maybe these problems are just linked with each other. Like maybe the photoelectric effect and special relativity and Brownian motion, they're kind of, you start thinking a certain way and all of these things just fall out. They're like basically the same branch of a tree. But I think it's such an interesting pattern. Like we really need to better
How
understand
much of it is just they went through some event, like you just mentioned, a pandemic hits, you get ordered to go home. Your thesis gets denied, essentially, and so there's like a negative event that then forces you to refocus or prove people wrong or some effect, or also it's focus. Get sent home. Obviously, the last 2 years with the fantasy writer, right, sitting at home during the pandemic, like I do think there's a lot of weight in today's society I break distractions into two buckets. There's like distractions we recognize and then distractions that we don't think of as distractions. And so distractions we recognize are simple. Notifications on your phone, you're bullshitting on, doom scrolling on Twitter, you're watching Netflix, like you're doing all these things that you're like, this is mindless activity. I may enjoy it, but like it's definitely a distraction from productive work, right? Then there's things which some of you actually mentioned, email, meetings, conferences, like obligations. We don't think of those necessarily as distractions because we think that there's some reason why we're doing it. We've explained to ourselves that it is an obligation and that's why I'm doing it. But if you actually just look at both of those activities as distractions and say, whether I'm doom scrolling or I'm at a conference that I feel obligated to go to, and you just pull all of that away, how much more productivity, how many more breakthroughs could people have in any industry by simply just focusing?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's such a great point. Like there's my friends in tech, some of them are like startup founders, they're like going to this conference here and like grabbing coffee here. And the question is like, what is your purpose on earth right now? Like what is the thing you're trying to maximize, right? You're trying to get more users, or like, let's say if you're like a content creator, you're like trying to get more people to hear your content. You have like a specific target you're trying to achieve. How does like grabbing coffee with a random person fulfill that goal? Not that you shouldn't do it, but you should understand that like that is not your job, right? That is not the thing you're like put on earth to do at that particular moment. And I think another interesting thing is I wonder if people listen to a lot of podcasts and audiobooks and stuff like that. I wonder if that, I honestly don't have a good opinion yet of, should I think of that as a distraction or should I think of that as, it's helping you think about the world, it's making you more creative, so on. Because I think like a big part of the reason people listen to podcasts, obviously not this one, other podcasts, is like just vicarious. Like by you vicariously 100%. Just want to participate in like a conversation or like with friends or something.
It goes back to like the stoic argument of like, how painful is it to sit by yourself with nothing, right? And I don't know about you, but for me, I put aside intentional time to go for a walk outside and I don't look at my phone. And what I have noticed is like value per minute on that walk is off the charts compared to any other activity I do. And it has nothing to do with what I'm actually doing. Yeah, sure, there's science of you're walking, your brain, and all this activity, whatever. But it's actually just like my nose isn't in this supercomputer in my pocket and trying to figure out, what's going on in the world. And so it goes back to like focus and clarity and all these things. It's just that the incentives and literally the way our brains are wired is to get the dopamine hit.
Or just think about like, people say they get their best ideas when they're taking a shower. It's not because there's something magical about like water running down your face that makes you more creative. It's that is the only time in your day that you are not hearing the input of other minds, right? That is the only time for most people, you're driving, you're listening to music, you're listening to podcasts. For, you get home, you're on YouTube, blah, blah, blah. You're at work, meetings. How much of your day in like actual minutes is you not consuming the input of other minds?
Do you think that many of the scientists, inventors, and kind of innovators of the past, they had just made distractions? They didn't have supercomputers in their pocket, but they had other things that served as distractions? Or do you think they just naturally, given the lack of technology accessibility that we have today, they just had less distractions and therefore could spend more time thinking?
I think that's got to be it, right? Like if you, it just like would physically not be possible. You're like walking somewhere, you can't like plug in something in your ears. It just like physically would not be possible to occupy all your time with the input of other minds, right? Or if you're doing it, you have to do it in like a very intentional way of like, I'm going to engage this person in conversation. Yeah, it's almost even interesting to think about like, it's so almost unrelatable if you actually had to spend some time in a previous era, me having grown up with like these technologies, it's almost like hard to relate to some. I would just be very curious about like the day to day of somebody like that.
I also wonder how much of the breakthroughs that we've seen in math, science, hard technology in prior years and decades, even centuries, comes from the sheer number of people focused on those problems versus now, going back to our conversation earlier, how many of our smartest folks are thinking about other things. Like a great example. How many intelligent people are focused on building Facebook, Instagram, Google, TikTok, and like e-commerce sites?
Yeah.
I probably just nailed about, 30% of like the tech industry, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever it is. And again, it's not to say that like Google search has this amazing mission of like getting people information and like doing all this stuff. But there is a very strong argument that those companies and technologies take talent away from nuclear power or from space exploration or something else. And so it's hard to compare and contrast like which one is like better for humanity, right? Because they're different things. But there's definitely something to the fact that like a portion of our smartest people or the people who would have those breakthroughs, they're not working on certain things because they've chosen to work on other things.
Yeah. I have a hard time thinking about what I should, because I went to India earlier this year, and we get out of the airport and I get in the car and the driver pulls up Google Maps, and I'm like, no way that shit works on like the roads in India. Like you got these, like half the roads are just filled with people, so you can't even drive on them. Like how could this possibly? And I think no, it's actually gotten pretty good. It's you can actually use this for navigation and basically at least all the big cities and stuff. And this is a technology developed in Silicon Valley by these people who are like just like hard coders, not working on these hard tech things. But now it allows this guy in India to navigate the difficult streets. Probably makes his quality of life much better and all kinds of different
Helps
ways.
him make money, economic mobility.
Exactly. So there's, I think, a lot of indirect ways in which big tech is actually really good all around the world, especially around the world. Because if you look at Facebook's revenue per user in America, what is it like? It's like, wasn't it like $20 per month or something like that? In like India, it's probably like less than a tenth of that. So they're probably losing money on working in these emerging markets, but American consumers are actually subsidizing them being able to buy products for the rest of the world.
Yes. But I don't think that it's big tech is bad. Like that, I think that argument, other than maybe the most extreme kind of folks that are critics of Silicon Valley believe that, but outside of that, I think everyone realizes like, hey, these companies are a net positive for society. And like, how privileged are we to argue about disinformation in the United States when literally some of these products are WhatsApp is the way that the world communicates, in many countries. And so, it's a first world problem, right? Yeah. But that doesn't mean that the companies behind it or the work they've done are net negative. Yeah. It just means that nothing is 100% positive. Like everything. Hey, there's cars that get in car crashes. Should we not have cars? Like, no, we probably should have cars and make them safer, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just though that at what point is the incremental engineer that goes to one of those companies, the output or productivity that they provide is not nearly as much as if they went and worked in another industry that maybe doesn't have as many people or the problem is harder or can affect more people.
I think that's a great point. Like, I think once the industry's mature, they get really good at recruiting people. So, if you're like, I just graduated computer science. So if you're a computer science student, you know exactly what to do to get a job at Facebook or Google, or, it's just like, you go to the job fair, you give them your resume, you know exactly what you need to do in terms of internships to get a job there. Where it's like, if you just want to think, college students, like from first principles, he's thinking, what is the most important thing I could be working on? There's not like an obvious way in which you're like, the nuclear fusion guy's going to show up to your job fair, right? Mm-hmm. So I think once these industries get big, companies get big, they're really good at recruiting, which means they get more talent because they've gotten good at it. Which means that the new industries, like they don't have the time or the knowledge to actually be able to recruit these people effectively, which if you are that kind of, and also they don't have the prestige, right? Like there's a certain kind of prestige associated with like working at Google or like, I think it's similar with like finance people and like working at like McKinsey or Goldman Sachs. And so if you are one of these small companies, I think it's very important you develop an edge you can't just recruit the same person that like Google knows to recruit. You can't just like be looking at, oh, these guys are like really intelligent and he's like hardworking and he has like good internships on their resume. Because every other company is looking for the same thing, right? You need some, like with the PayPal Mafia, right? You need some unique edge, some like unique way to think about talent that helps you find the people that Google would have ignored or Facebook would have ignored. Like when people say Harvard is selective, or like Google is selective, it's selective in the sense that they reject a lot of people. But often these are the best people. Often they're optimizing for the wrong thing. Like who is doing the selection? It's like some humanities person. People who write college essays know exactly how to game this shit, right? You have to have an edge if you want to beat out these prestigious institutions.
Paul Graham talks a lot about many people have to unlearn what they learned, or like learn to unlearn, right? And it's because in one of his essays, he talks about people who'd get to Y Combinator and they would say, okay, like basically what is the test, right? Tell me what, like how do I do this so that I'm quote unquote successful? He's like, that's the problem. Like your entire life you were taught, okay, come to class, take notes, take the test, regurgitate what you learned in class and in your notes on the test. You know, here's your A, move on to the next thing. And you just kept doing that over and over and over again. He goes, but now like there is no test, right? It is actually a ambiguous environment where there's multivariate inputs that you then have to synthesize and figure out the answer. But the answer is not, the teacher or some standardized test is determining the answer. The answer is what do the customers want? And the customers are an ever-changing, kind of target. They can like one thing on day one and they can like something else on day two. They may like different severities. They could actually say, you know what, you both have, you and your competitor have similar products, but price becomes a component. Or maybe it's quality. Like you have to figure all this stuff out. People who are good at school suck in that environment. And so I actually think that the reason why Google and a place like McKinsey or Goldman or whatever becomes so great at recruiting is because they're pulling from the largest pool. Most people do not want to take risk. They do not want to be the outlier, and they do not want to go and have failure. And so what is the quote unquote safe thing to do? Go work at a place where you can go home and you're not worried about whether they're paying payroll or not. You go home and you tell your parents, hey, I work at Goldman Sachs. Hey, I work at Google, right? And you work on something that is interesting enough because you're in this environment where somebody has told you like this is the most important thing or this is a prestigious thing to do. And so like you're satisfied because you almost don't know anything else. And so one of my favorite things to do is talk to people who are graduating college and like, I want to go be an investment banker. And I'm like, have you ever like spent time with investment bankers? Like go. And they're like, oh, I did an internship. I'm like, cool. Tell me about the internship. I'm like, was it fun? And they're like, well, we like did like a lot of like happy hour things. And like, it was like kind of interesting, whatever. And I'm
that's
like,
what your job is going to be, happy hour.
I'm like, okay. And then I'll talk to them like a year later. And I'll be like, hey, how's it going? And they're like, this is hard. Right? Like, yeah, no shit, it's hard, right? Like they are going to burn through a bunch of these young people, and some people enjoy it and stay and other people churn out. Now, that doesn't mean people shouldn't go into investment banking or anything like that. But what it does mean is that along that path, there's a lot of people who opt out. They thought they wanted one thing and they changed their mind. I think society would be much better off if we made it more normal for people to take bold risk. The problem is failure is a negative. And so most of society looks at it, you tried something, you failed, you're an idiot. Instead, if we just said, look, everyone's a scientist. Go run experiments. And by the way, if you run an experiment, it's not that you failed, it's that the experiment didn't work. Imagine how much further along we would get and how much quicker we would be able to create progress, innovation in various pieces of technology if everyone was encouraged to try the boldest, craziest ideas they had. And if you, quote unquote, failed or the experiment didn't work, it's fine, go again.
This goes back to what you said earlier about we judge these ideas, some of which didn't work, as bad. When before they sounded just as crazy or just as good as Airbnb. Afterwards, if Airbnb had failed, we could say like, come on, you're going to let strangers live in your house? Like that's stupid. I think that's true of like a lot of things you could work on where the difference is just, there is an element of luck where just like things you learn over time. Where if Airbnb had failed, like, they had like, they had like tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt. So they'd probably be in like bankruptcy court or something at this point if Airbnb had failed. So then you could just like laugh at them. But there's like a lot of counterfacts. If you're trying to do something really ambitious, like in most cases, you'll probably fail, right? You're trying to make that small probability bet that this thing really explodes, and that the small probability makes it worth it. But then you shouldn't judge people who just ended up on the wrong side of that equation.
We as an entire society went from the underdogs to the incumbent, right? And I always think about the idea of like everyone starts out as the underdog, as the competitor, as the upstart. But if you live long enough, you either die or you become the man, right? So Bill Gates was the kid in the garage trying to disrupt folks. Now, the internet is like Bill Gates is the evil billionaire, and he's like going to microchip everybody, right? And so when you view that, countries can do that, societies can do that. And if you were to look at the energy around innovation and progress and kind of taking bold risks and this experimentation in a country like Nigeria, in a country like India, or a country like America, it doesn't mean that there's none in America. But it definitely means because of demographics, because of the lack of anything really to lose, there is incredible energy. And so I believe that in the United States, if we can get back to that, the problem is there used to be one place in the country where that was heavily encouraged, which was Silicon Valley.
Yep.
And people could go there and you could fail over and over and over again, and no one judged you for it. It was just like, cool, what's your next idea? Like I don't even want to talk about the other one. Like, what's the next one? Because all power law. As that gets dispersed around the country, it goes one of two ways probably. Either one, other places learn that, and then we get multiple kind of areas of innovation, or it disperses and kind of fades away, and we just become the fat cat that is ripe for disruption.
Right. The reason that Silicon Valley it has a spirit is because if you're wrong and you like publicly criticize a person, you're like, this won't work, right? If you're wrong, it's like really like who's the founder of Anadrol? What's his name?
Anadrol, Palmer Luckey.
Palmer Luckey. Did you see the thing about him going on Jason Calacanis'
podcast? Him and Jason. That's the next 2 decades. That's gonna be the feud. Is like Palmer Luckey will never let that die, and Jason is also gonna not just let Palmer turn him into a punching bag. So like they're gonna keep going at it for decades.
The hilarious thing is Jason tries to keep on like Twitter and on his he like tries to like turn it around by like saying nice things about Palmer, and every time he does, Palmer just responds in the most brutal way. Like, but that's the thing, right? Like, if you're like, I don't want to like judge Jason in particular. I don't know the details, but let's say you're the kind of person who judges someone too harshly, too early, and you're like, oh, this guy's an idiot. This thing's not going to work. If it does work, you look like a fucking idiot, right? In Silicon Valley, it happens so often that like people are like really averse to judging people who fail. Whereas in the rest of the world, somebody doing something crazy. I was talking to somebody who's a software engineer in the UK. And he was talking, we're at this conference where people were like, had these all kinds of cool ideas. He was saying, if this was in the UK and somebody came up with like an idea, like, I want to build like a defense startup or something, people would just like laugh him out of the room, right? There's this like tall poppy syndrome. So I think America has still like conserved that spirit quite well, actually. Even in India, because of the hierarchical like caste system kind of thing, I think like Bangalore and other places that are like startup hubs, they're probably different, but still similar, like how Silicon Valley is different from the rest of America, or was. But yeah, I think America is still like surprised. Like it's like if you're here, it's being a fish in water. But if you go to the rest of the world and you ask people, go to Japan or Singapore or something, how many of you want to start your own business? No hands raised. You come to the US and you like just go to a random room. How many of you want to start your own business at some point? People might not do it, but they're going to raise their hand, right? So yeah,
it's almost like Americans to some degree almost have like more arrogance. Like everyone raises their hand, but only half of them do it.
Yeah. Right. Have you seen those polls about they look at American kids and Asian kids and they ask them like, are you better than average in math? And like all the American kids raise their hand and the Asians are like a quarter raise their hand or something.
Who's better? Right. But like the generalizations end up having some kernel of truth to it. Right. The other thing too about, I think, American like ambition and innovation, is there is a resurgence, I think, where we hit this lull, and now you see a bunch of these companies that are coming up over the last 3 or 4 years where they're taking big swings. Remains to be seen whether they will be successful or not. But I do think that this almost renaissance to some degree is important. But it's coming from the entrepreneurs. It's coming from the innovators and kind of the scientists and all of that. It's not coming from the politicians or the government. And what's fascinating to me is that in the mainstream conversation, the conversation has very much shifted in America over the last 50 years to what can the government do for me?
Yeah.
Right? But there's almost like this little group, and you can almost think of it like, there's the general military, and then you have the Navy SEALs. We need the Navy SEALs to continue to be ambitious and go do the shit that no one else wants to do, right? We need the select group of startups to be highly ambitious and go try to drive innovation and do the impossible, because the rest of society is, one, not going to do it. They don't have the risk appetite to do it. And actually they're shifting the other way. And there's this rise of, now we're going to get free money. When's the next stimulus bill coming?
Yeah.
And so I think that it's a very interesting thing, but it's not a story that's over yet.
Yeah. No, that's the, not only does the entrepreneurial part of society have to be powerful, but just to keep up with all this redistribution and all this rent, not even redistribution, the rent seeking, right? It's the infrastructure bill, the money in there, it's not it's getting redistributed. It's just who knows where it's going? Some contractors really wealthy and happy now, but are there any more trains or railroads or bridges that are going to get built? We'll see. There's actually, I think that in the 2009 bill for the stimulus in 2009, they gave $30 billion to build train tracks in the U.S. and 0 new miles were built. So literally, if you just do the equation, 30 billion divided by 0 miles, it costs infinity dollars to build a mile of railroad in America. But yeah, so this is the productive part of society. They're actually building new goods and services. They need to keep growing exponentially just to keep up with the rent seeking from the rest of society. But the optimistic white pill is, since they're growing exponentially, over time, they'll become more and more important. Now, maybe they become entrenched and maybe they become part of the new establishment, but hopefully, Elon is the wealthiest person in the world right now, right? Hopefully more and more power goes to these kinds of, people who are building stuff, doing cool things. I mean, that's a white pill.
If you think of Elon and Jeff Bezos, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the two that battle back and forth on the wealthiest person in the world. There's a reason why they're the wealthiest.
Yeah.
Amazon is an incredible business that I can press a button on my phone and something shows up the next day. That is insane. You probably should be one of the wealthiest people in the world, right? And so I think if you look at the top, I think it's the top 25 of the Forbes 400, none of them are day traders or investment types, right? It's all, again, power law. It's the people who built highly innovative products or who are in the family lineage, right? So the Walmart family, they end up being, each one of the Walton siblings is up on that list pretty high, but somebody in their family lineage built Walmart, which, is similar to an Amazon. Yeah,
no, I think that Walmart is an excellent example of, there was this economist, Thomas Piketty, who wrote this book, Capital in the 21st Century. It was hugely influential a few years ago. And the point he was making is, over time, in societies, what happens is wealthy people will accumulate resources, they'll hand them down to their kids, they'll accumulate resources, and the rate of return to capital, if you think about the S&P growth rate, is higher than the rate at which the price of labor grows. Mm-hmm. So over time, they will, society become more and more unequal, more and more hereditary. And he doesn't talk about this, but it's also true that there's a genetic component to this. Children of wealthier, more successful people are also likely to be more successful. And so in that way, even there's a genetic endowment that skews things. And if you look through history, most of there's so often a complete drawdown of wealth because of war, because of revolution, because of some crisis. And then either the scales get completely leveled or the resources are redistributed. Interestingly, I think America is the only country in the Western world, maybe the entire world, but the only country where there hasn't been a complete complete drawdown of wealth. Mm-hmm. You don't just reset to zero. That hasn't happened in America, which maybe makes us more optimistic, but also more more maybe not cognizant of like the actual risk that civilization is taking. But yeah, but the Walmart is actually a great example of this because the family as a whole is really rich, right? But like each individual Waltonite is, they're not the richest people in the world. The richest people in the world, as you just said, are the people who just like recently made their money, which goes against the Piketty thesis.
But is that not in a technology age? Will that not continue to happen?
Yeah.
Where because of the rate of change and improvement in technology and the constant reinvention. I mean, if you look, TikTok is now the most popular website in the world. That didn't exist 10 years ago, right? And so because of that occurring, the incumbents are actually at a disadvantage to remain the wealthiest. Now, they're still going to be rich, right? Or their companies will still be powerful and have a lot of resources. But actually, the advantage is to those who have speed and can continue to reinvent using the new technologies. And just naturally, because of the innovator's dilemma, the incumbents likely don't do that as well as kind of new upstarts.
Yes, I think that's the key. Like people complain, when people complain about wealth inequality, when they say like the wealthiest 0.1% has so many of the resources, what they're not considering is that 0.1% is changing all the time, right? Mm-hmm. That would be really concerning in a country where there isn't that level of turnover like you talked about. I think in Italy, if you look at the wealthiest people in the country in like the 1600s or something, there's some guy did this brilliant study where he's like looking at the last names and he's like, okay, who are the wealthiest people in Italy today? Who are the wealthiest people in 1600? I think like most of the top 25 or something are like literally direct descendants.
Wow.
So like from 1600 to now, in a country where there's like no economic growth, basically, one of my friends put it this way, Europe is like a living museum.
Which is part of the reason why people like to visit.
Right.
Right. But if you're going to be in the technology industry, I think there's a lot of people who say, hey, that's a disadvantage, then maybe somewhere else.
Yeah.
You've done a lot of interviews around long-termism. What is that concept? Like, why are you so fascinated with it? What's up, guys? I hope you're enjoying this conversation with Dwarkesh. He's got an awesome podcast that I listen to regularly called The Lunar Society. You can go down into the description, click on the link there to either YouTube or the audio. All right, let's get back into the episode. I hope you guys are enjoying it.
Yeah, no, I think this is going to be the things that we're really going to start talking about in a few years. And I think this is really interesting and important to think about. You look at, we tend to think about the world, like what's going to happen in 10 years, what's going to happen in 20 years, what's going to happen in 50 years. But if you think about like how long civilization could exist, thousands, maybe millions of years, billions of years, right? Like civilization could hang around for as long as the universe exists. And it's like 10 to the 500 power years until like all the protons decay away and there's like nothing left. So that gets really abstract if you think that far out. But you just think like, we want civilization to be around in 1,000 years, right? We want civilization to be flourishing. We want people, we just want all kinds of creative, cool things to happen. Just think about how much the world has changed in like the last 1,000 years. We've grown so much wealthier. Life is so much better. Just think if that process could continue longer. And it's really interesting. You can start to think from first principles because you can't just extrapolate trends if you're talking that far out. You really have to think about first principles of like, what is going to matter in the long term? It's going to be things like if we build through human enhancement or through AI, things that are way smarter than us, that's going to be a big deal. If we go extinct because of a pathogen, because of nuclear war, because of other kinds of disruptions, that's going to be a big deal. Which allows you to ignore actually a lot of the day-to-day news. Like if you look at a newspaper from 100 years ago, how much of the stuff they're talking about actually mattered in the long run? Same thing like if you open up the New York Times, like what are the odds that any article there is going to be something that 100 years from now people are going to be like, that actually was important to think about at the time? Zero chance, right? So then you start thinking about like what matters in the long term? Because if most people are going to live in the future, and if people are like worth roughly equally as much, most of the value that could potentially exists in the far future. We want to make sure those people flourish as much as possible. So there's all kinds of interesting ideas about how to make sure their lives are good.
Like what is that idea? Like how do you make their lives better today?
Yeah. So one thing is just making sure civilization doesn't go extinct, right? Like they can't exist if civilization goes extinct. But there's a big debate, and this is why this field is really interesting to me. There's huge debates about how to make sure that the future goes really well. And the good thing is like it's not mired in like politics or anything. People are just thinking from like first principles. One interesting debate, there's economist Tyler Cowen who says that over the long term, the only thing that matters is economic growth. So you want to maximize economic growth. A really interesting anecdote he gives is between 1880 and 1990, if the rate of economic growth in the US had just been 1% lower per year, so like that's like a normal range of fluctuation, right? Just 1% lower every single year, the US in 1990 would be as rich as Mexico was in 1990 per capita, right?
Wow.
So over time, the rate of economic growth is the thing that matters most. But so right now, the rate of economic growth is like 2% approximately worldwide, and it's slowing down, which is really concerning. But this just raises an interesting prospect, because if you think about like 2% growth, that's like the economy is doubling every 35 years. How long can it keep doing that? Like doubling every 35 years. It can keep doing that for maybe like the next 100 years, maybe the next 200 years. Can it keep doing that for the next 1,000 years? How about the next 10,000 years? Because if you extrapolate 2% growth from our current economy to like 8,000 years from now, that would mean that every single atom in the galaxy had to support as much economic value as the entire world has today, right? So, which means that like probably this rate of growth can't continue for forever, which means the times that there's a lot of growth, lots of things are changing, lots of new technologies are coming about, lots of new political institutions are coming about. That may be the most important time in history, because like that determines what happens in the far future. So we could potentially be living in the most important century in history. And that changes everything about what you think is important to work on.
Because right now, if we can, one, the economic growth already could potentially make that argument. But if we could increase economic growth through technology and other innovations, then definitely it puts a emphasis on the current moment.
Yes. Or just think about, like, let's say we develop AI, right? Full AI. I think there's actually a good chance it happens this century. Like it would
like full artificial intelligence, not like, hey, I have a startup and I use the term AI and like I don't even know what that means. Which, by the way, there have been people who have pitched me AI startups, and I say, this isn't AI, this is machine learning, and they say, no, it's AI, and I'm like, okay, how do you do it? And then they just like literally textbook description of machine learning.
It's like just linear regression or something.
Like okay, and by the way, like I'm not an expert, right? Like you know, I can Google, but like all right, and so like I do think that this whole thing of like actual artificial intelligence is what seems to be much further off than I think most people realize.
Yeah.
But you think it could happen this century?
Yeah, I think it's actually more likely than not.
Why?
Because if you just extrapolate the trends in AI, you think about GPT-3, it's able to write like full essays. You think about how much more powerful that is in GPT-2. I think they've raised the parameters by an order of magnitude or something, and it's just so much more powerful. You do that like 2 or 3 more times, you raise the order of magnitude. I think the training cost of GPT-3 was like 10 million or something, which is like, you're talking about the potentially on the track of building the most powerful technology in history. That's nothing, right? Mm-hmm. Think about when people start throwing real money at it. The idea that you could just scale a model like GPT-3 to AGI, it's called a scaling hypothesis. The basic idea is you just make this shit bigger. Eventually it'll get smarter and smarter until it's AGI.
You make what bigger? You make the training sets?
Or like the amount of parameters in the model.
Got it, okay.
I actually had a guy on the podcast recently who actually did an estimate of this. You think about the computational capacity of the brain, and you think about how big these models are, or how much computational capacity they use. We're only a couple of orders of magnitude away from actually having enough computation to emulate the brain. That doesn't necessarily mean we'll like actually know how to do it. So that's why there's a lot of uncertainty there. But if that happens, like this thing could be seriously smarter than we are. We had to really make sure that it's aligned. It's a lot like aligned with our goals. And another interesting thing, like which would make this century really, really impactful, and this I think is a near certainty, is human enhancement. I just had this guy on my podcast. It'll be released next week. Stephen Shu. He's working on genomic prediction. The basic idea is it's called embryo selection. You basically do IVF. In vitro fertilization, you have multiple embryos. You select the one that has the greatest potential to become like really smart, right? You do that over and over again. Over time, you can get like you can make somebody who's like way smarter than somebody who's ever existed by just selecting for all the genomic sequences.
Is that like controversial to do?
Oh yeah. Why? Well, the idea is, the people who are going to be afford this are the rich people. If you do that, then like the rich people will be like get actual genetic entrenched advantage over time. But it's just like it's not that expensive. Like just give it to everybody for free, right?
But like the actual act, forget who's doing it for a second, right? Like if we have a human race and our goal is to improve the human experience, right? Or like whatever we're optimizing for is like constantly improve, constantly progress. One huge input is to have intelligent humans operating in the world. On top of that, you want people who have very specific components, right, or kind of inputs into it that aren't just intelligence. And so what those are, obviously there's going to be a debate, right? Who gets to determine? How do we measure? Do we know with certainty? Is there probability? Whatever. But there's some framework that we're like, cool, these people will become more productive members of society.
Yep.
And it feeds back to I have a friend who will go unnamed who believes that it is Elon Musk's duty to humanity to have as many children as possible because he's Elon Musk and we need as much intelligence as possible. And so like he's a pretty good person to like put some life out there into the world.
He seems to be doing a pretty good job of
he's
making
definitely
progress.
doing it. I don't know if that's why he's doing it, but he's definitely, you know, he's up to, I think he's in double digit kids, which like, you know, hasn't been seen for a few centuries on average. But if you think about this idea, it's like, okay, I think what makes it controversial to people is, to your point, one, who's doing it, right? Like the cost barriers, but also too, like, I think it just scares people that like, wait, you mean that we as humans could have some element of contribution to the increasing intelligence of humanity? Because it makes us feel better to almost think like, okay, you know, two people have sex, baby comes out, and just like whatever whatever the combination of these two people, and we almost think of it like eye color or hair color or whatever it is. Like, let's see.
Yeah.
But if you gave parents the ability to choose, I don't know how many people would say they'd do it, but I got to think it's a pretty high percentage of people would say, hey, I do want to pick the baby's eye color. I do want to pick the baby's, hair. Yeah. I do want to pick, if you give me 4 embryos, and by the way, we're going to pick one of the 4 anyways, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Then don't I want to have some data to pick embryos that I can optimize for whatever. Maybe it's not intelligence I want to optimize for. Maybe it's literally, hey, there's 3 that have a high probability of brown hair and 1 that has blonde hair, and I want a blonde haired baby. Like, the data ends up being pretty important.
Or like, it's not even that. Like, the thing these companies start off with, and they like to talk about like, oh, this is the only thing we're ever going to do, right? We're never going to talk about intelligence. The thing they start off with is just health. Yes. So you look at the diabetes risk of these babies, you look at the heart disease risk, you look at the cancer risk, and you're like, okay, well, I want my kid to be healthy. I'll pick the one that has the least risk of having these things. That's where you start. You can't draw a line there, right? Like you could pick any of these embryos. I just want to pick the one that's going to make sure that my baby is healthy as possible. You go down that road, right? Like health correlates with intelligence. Okay, so why don't we just start testing for intelligence? Why don't we start testing for high? You can just go down this road, right? There's also other kinds of interesting technologies, like just cloning. Like we can clone a fucking horse now, right? We could clone a human. We could do it now, and we have.
You think so?
Yes. Just like nobody gives a shit enough. This was in China. They did the CRISPR thing.
Wait, you got to back up for a second. People can clone a full-blown horse?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Oh, I mean,
like I take like a 3D image of the horse and then I like 3D print the horse. Like how does this work?
I don't remember the exact details, but it's like it still has to gestate in like.
Okay, so it's basically like, somehow take the like
DNA.
the DNA makeup of the horse. It still goes through kind of a birthing process or whatever, and then it becomes essentially the same exact horse. So this is more of genetic kind of science than it is some sort of like.
Oh no, it's not like Star Trek.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I was like, all right, I have not seen that. I got to go do some more research. All right, and so your whole idea is like we could do the same exact thing because it's just genetics. We could do it for a human.
Yeah, no, this guy wrote a really interesting blog post about, John Neumann was this like brilliant scientist in the 20th century. Probably the most brilliant person who's ever lived that we know of, right? Okay. So he probably like an IQ of 180. He like. There's so many like stories of him like he'll come. People are working on problem for a week. Oh no, there's a great example of this where he shows up late to a lecture and a professor is like writing down a theorem on the board and he doesn't realize that he's writing. He missed the introduction where the professor was explaining that like he's trying to prove the theorem or explain it. So von Neumann just fills in the rest of the steps of the thing that the professor hadn't proved yet. He just like proves the theorem that the professor was trying to explain the introduction to. But no, he worked on so many like nuclear ballistics. He developed so many advances in like computer hardware, in quantum mechanics, like all kinds of things. Right? This guy was like the most brilliant person who ever lived. His body is in a cemetery in Princeton. You dig that up. You take a little sample. You have this DNA. You do get it sequenced. Then you clone him maybe a couple million times.
Why don't we do that?
That's what I'm saying.
But what do you know what the argument against it is?
I mean, it's probably illegal in the U.S. at least.
Yeah, but like, why?
I actually heard the story about like this guy he's like a math prodigy, and he was like just emailing every single scientist like he knew about. Like he was like, we know where the body is. Why don't we just go dig it up and like clone him? And so people have this idea. I don't like it. It just
is
like
it just an ethics thing? But so this is like a weird thing, right? Like there are what I would consider morals, right? Do not steal, do not cheat, do not like these things that I think most humans through most of history have bought into and said like, yes, for whatever reason, whether you agree or not, we have collectively agreed that like these are bad things to do. And those morals I think are important because they keep the fabric of society together. They give people a framework on how to act. And, you know, obviously I don't think anyone really wants to live in a society where it's like the purge, like just like go crazy, steal things, kill people, like, you know, every person for themselves. Like that doesn't seem to be super attractive to folks. But then there's this like element of ethics, which like I'm not clear as to why it is a bad idea to go find the smartest fucking person that's ever lived in the world and take their DNA and try to recreate that over and over and over again so that we can solve some of our hardest problems.
These people matter a lot, right? Like we clone Elon Musk. The thing with him having kids is there's a lot of regression to the mean. Mm-hmm. So his kids are probably not going to be as good as he was, just the same way as like Einstein's kids weren't as good as he was. Yep. It just like, it's very hard to keep that track. But if it's an exact clone of you, then it's a different story, right? Mm-hmm. Just think about how much value Elon Musk has created for the world. Make a bunch of copies of him. You know, like we could have so much more. So I think,
or are people just scared? Like, does that just scare the shit out of people? And so naturally it's like, oh, we can't do that. That's bad. Like it violates our ethics. Like if that's illegal.
Right.
But then in 100 years, people will be like, look how stupid these humans were who created laws. It was illegal to do this.
Yeah.
Like if you go back and you look at laws that were written 100 years ago, many times they've now been repealed or changed or whatever. We laugh at them. Yeah. Right. We're like, that was illegal? Like, that's what we all do today.
I think, and the thing is, even if we ban it, like China's going to do it, somebody else is going to do it.
China don't give a fuck. They gotta go find the absolute smartest people they can. Yeah. They don't care if they're Chinese or any other nationality or ethnicity, and they are going to do everything they possibly can to get geniuses.
Yeah, and that's a huge advantage. Like, if you think about who really, like military tech, for example, or like just advances in physics, hardware, whatever, you need the smartest people, right? And there's not that many of them around. Like if you have more of them, you have a huge advantage.
Does this also play out not just with intelligence, but like, for example, is the Chinese military going to create like Herculean looking cyborgs that all of a sudden we're like, damn, our humans aren't made like that? And it's because they are using some sort of technology that maybe from an ethical standpoint, the U.S., whether rightfully or wrongfully, has decided we're not willing to use, and they are?
Yeah, I think we're going to see some really wild shit in the near future. Like, I think there's two paths of the future. One is you have this human enhancement path. And so then the most powerful people in the world are these like enhanced, like just crazy alterations of these people. And these people are like way smarter, way more capable. And the other path is you just go completely artificial. You have an artificial general intelligence. One of these two things I think is likely to happen by the end of the century. And when you take that seriously, I mean, there's all kinds of other interesting trends that I think will happen this century. I think we might have energy superabundance. Energy is like super fucking cheap. You can just travel from any point in the world to any other point in like a matter of minutes.
Why is it going to get so cheap?
Like solar and wind are getting, like, if you've seen the curves of the price on those, they just like drop exponentially. There's the prospect that nuclear could be much better. If you know about like the regulations, you know that it's been hamstrung for decades. If you get rid of that, you know, like nuclear could be way cheaper and way better.
That's another like fake ethical thing, it seems like.
Well, the thing with the ethics stuff is you have, during COVID, you had these bioethicists who were going to do, people had this idea you could do human challenge trials, whereas you give somebody the vaccine, we had the vaccine before the virus even entered America. They had designed the vaccine. So, but it took till November, December. We had to fast track it, and it still took us a year to approve the vaccine, right? So these people had the idea, okay, the way the current process works is you give somebody the vaccine. If they happen to encounter COVID and they avert it, then you know that the thing works, right? The idea was you give these people the vaccine as early as possible, then you inject them with COVID. And if they're able to avoid COVID or don't have the symptoms, you know the vaccine works. These people volunteer to do this. They're getting paid to do it. It's all it's all full disclosure and transparency. It would have sped up the vaccine by many months. Would have saved more than 300,000 lives. We were planning on this is something we could have done, but then the bioethicists were like, "No, this is unethical." And I'm an expert on ethics, so I can tell you that this is unethical.
What the fuck does that mean?
No, exactly, right? It's like, okay, I get like you're an expert in like the proteins that make up the vaccine. I get you could be like an actual expert in biology. What does it mean to be an expert in ethics?
I would argue you can't even be an expert in biology. You can be one of the best first people on what we currently understand about biology. Yeah. But like we sure as hell understand less than the things that we don't understand. Right. And so like, sure, we'll call that expertise for now. But on ethics, it just feels like it's
just made up.
I want to stop shy of saying it's made up because there are like morals again, right? Like there's things that I think as a society we all agree, like do not cheat, do not steal, all that. But ethics has become this like catch-all for just like anything that we think we could complain about goes in like the ethics bucket. Yeah. And so, for example, if you have consenting adults who say, "Hey, I'm willing to do this. I understand the risks and I'm signing whatever. I'm a young, healthy person, yada, whatever." And somebody comes in and says, "That's unethical." Like, fuck you, right? Why do you get to tell somebody what they can do with their body? Yeah. Now all of a sudden it starts entering into like the whole conversation around like, wait a minute, shouldn't you be able to do whatever you want to do? And this gets at like, well, you can't go shoot up heroin. Well, people still fucking do it, and I don't see anyone being like, that's unethical, right? Like, I'm a bioethicist, and you shouldn't be allowed to do that. No, they make a legal argument. And so it's this very weird thing where I think we've tricked ourselves as a society, specifically in America, that there are certain things in science, math, and technology that are off limits, which means that we are not doing science. If things are off limits from an experimentation standpoint, again, there's the right way to do it. There's opting in, there's consent, there's all this stuff. But if people are willing to do it, and we say you're not allowed to do that, or we say that is unethical, what's the difference between science and religion? This episode is brought to you by 8 Sleep. Good sleep is a game changer, and the 8 Sleep Pod is the best sleep machine. I sleep on it every single night. A great night of sleep allows you to be healthier, be more rested, and have more energy throughout the day. And on the brand new 8 Sleep Pod 3, you can sleep as cold as 55 degrees Fahrenheit or as hot as 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the secret of thermoregulation. Better sleep, better energy. Get yourself an 8 Sleep. You can go to 8sleep.com/pomp today to go ahead and get $150 off your order. 8sleep.com/pomp. Not only do I sleep on it every night, it literally changed my life, and I begged the founders to let me invest in the company. 8sleep.com/pomp. Go get yourself an 8 Sleep pod and get a better night of sleep.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this ethics stuff is just that, people have different intuitions. I get that, right? Like some people, they personally wouldn't want like to go through this experiment. That's totally fine. People have like intuitions about, technology or whatever, right? And so they're like, I don't like that. But if you say, I don't like that, you can't get like power to take your side. You can't get the government to take your side. But if you make the argument, no, this is unethical, right? Then that's like a political formula. That's a thing that you can go to the government and say, it's unethical, therefore we should regulate it.
An expert in ethics, by the way, makes me think of like somebody saying, I'm an expert in opinions. Right? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And then it also, I think a step further is like, as a society, we need certain people to do shit that everyone doesn't want to do.
Yeah.
Like the reason why we have a safe country for the most part is because there are badass men who are willing to go in the dark of night and kill people in other worlds.
Right.
Guess what? Nobody likes talking about it. But I don't want to go do that shit. You don't want to go do that shit. And 99.9% of Americans don't want to go do that shit.
Right.
But we got some bad motherfuckers that'll go do it for us.
Yeah.
And guess what? We celebrate them. We do it in this weird way where it's like, oh, you're a Navy SEAL. That sounds courageous. But like when you really look at like what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, it's nasty shit.
Yeah.
There has to be in a bunch of other fields, like what's the equivalent of the group of people who are willing to dedicate their lives to do certain things for some higher cause that the average citizen doesn't want to do, but they're willing to do it.
Yeah. I think just the entire world is made up of these kinds of people. I mean, I don't know. It feels squirrely to like be a programmer or like be a content creator or something, and you realize that the building you're sitting in was made by people working at way lower wages than you, doing much harder work than you, right? It's like often these are like illegal immigrants or people who don't even have like basic legal protections and stuff. That's who is basically build a civilization around you. Just think of like the guy who collects your garbage, the guy who's making sure power is running to your house. So much of the civilization is just like this API, this interface you're connecting to, and it required so much hard work. It's like astounding when you think like everything, like think about a package you have and you're like trying to get it to the other side of the country, just like traveling to the other side of the country. You can't connect to any corporations. You can't connect to any government utility or anything. You just had to do it yourself. It would take you months, years. You would die on the way, right? I think
people used to do it, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like take the horse and carriage, and
right?
Like we're going west.
Yeah.
And it literally took months, and they had a very high probability of dying.
Right, exactly.
Now, obviously, with certain advancements in technology, you're unlikely to die, but it sure would still take a long time to do it, even with a car.
Yeah. And I think we also underestimate how much like, when we think about history, we often think in terms of these activist movements, or we think in terms of these political changes that have improved lives. And so the vision of history you have is very much like 1776, 1865, 1965, like this political movement, this activist movement. I think the real history of understanding of history would also include, maybe it would be more important to include, just like technological changes. If you think about we had the Green Revolution in the 20th century. Norman Borlaug was a guy who created a variety of wheat that was more resistant to, it was like more productive, many times more productive than the one before. And basically that was the thing that prevented like hundreds of millions of people potentially from dying in India and countries like that. It said that he probably saved 1 billion lives.
Wow.
Or think about the Haber-Bosch process for nitrogen fixation, which is used to make fertilizer. Without the fertilizer that has nitrogen, like crops could not grow to anywhere near the capacity they grow now. They would be land would not be as productive agriculturally speaking at all. There's an estimate that they allowed 3.2 billion people to live that would not otherwise exist. So billions of people, just like these technologies you talk about, we don't include, nobody knows about these people's names, right? They're probably the greatest people who ever lived in terms of if you think about their impact. And they're not included in our history.
There's one person, 1,000 years that will be known that lives today.
Satoshi?
No.
Okay.
Elon Musk. And it's not a guarantee yet.
Yeah.
He has to get us to Mars.
Yeah.
If he figures out Mars, he lives forever in the minds of a kid born 1,000 years from now.
You think he'll be able to get there by 2030?
The timeline's really hard. I think that SpaceX will get a vehicle or something to Mars. I question, will we get a human onto the surface of Mars? I don't know, the next 20 or 30 years? That one's like a tough one. Now, they believe it's going to be in the next 8 years, which like would be fucking like actually the 8-year part of that prediction is crazier to me than like get to Mars, because it feels like getting to Mars is the foregone conclusion at this point.
Yeah.
It's the time frame that would be mind-blowing.
I'm not even sure it's a foregone conclusion. Like we could have.
You don't think we'll get to Mars?
Or I don't know if it's like, if not for Elon Musk, I think it could have taken decades more, potentially never happened. Because
I don't think, unless somebody else like him came along, I don't think it was ever even people. The thing he did was he allowed people to even think it was possible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's still a lot of people who are like, why do you think it's possible? Because this dude said it, right? Like I don't know. He seems to be the expert, right? And so like if he says it's possible, then it must be possible. And it kind of goes back to like venture capital due diligence. Like there's some people who do the due diligence, and there's other people who say like, who's investing? X firm. All right, cool. They must have done the due diligence.
Right.
the problem here is that like I don't have the scientific expertise or knowledge to actually underwrite, is it possible or is it not? So like to some degree, expertise is important because we can look to folks, right? Like imagine if every single one of us had to go and learn about a virus, a vaccine, like all this stuff, and then come to a conclusion as to like what we should do, and then we all took like a democratic vote. Like that sounds like a nightmare. By the way, that's what DAOs are. In its current form. But if you think about kind of like Mars, it's like, yeah, I do think that we will get there. I just 8 years is, 7.5 years, right? Seems impossible, right? Like it really does. Like it is hard to think that way. But I guess if you look back, I mean, how many flights or how many launches per year was SpaceX doing 7.5 years ago? One, maybe. I don't know the numbers, right? But like they weren't doing one like every 3 days or whatever they're doing, like the rate of progress there is so incredible that like, sure, maybe.
Yeah. No, it's crazy. He's an excellent example of one person's vision can have a huge counterfactual impact. I think after he founded PayPal, there was like he immediately, it wasn't like he was going to like take a rest period or anything. He immediately started working on like Tesla. He had like plans for that immediately. It is astounding when you have a person who's like able to actually make their.
But think back 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. We couldn't name anyone. We don't fucking know anybody.
Yeah.
Right? Like literally no one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And guess what? They thought they were important. They thought their contributions to society were essential. There's somebody who thought they were the leader of, the free world or whatever. Nobody remembers their names. We, over the history of Earth, I don't know, 500 people, maybe, that we can think of that we're like, okay, these people are really important. But the further you get away from their inventions, the less important they become.
Yeah. I think it's also another example of the power law you're talking about, the venture, where if you think about impact on literature and who we remember, Shakespeare is like way up here. He's like the Tesla of literature.
Yes.
And then the next person is like probably less than half as important as him in terms of literature. And then you have just this long tail of people who are like, I'm going to be a great author, and nobody will ever remember your name.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or true of philosophers, true of like leaders, world leaders. The person who matters the most is going to matter so much more than everybody else combined.
Also, if things continue the way that they are going, when we talk about human enhancement, I was thinking to myself, if you walked out on the street in middle America, anywhere kind of outside of a tech industry hub, and you said, there's this thing called human enhancement. We have option A and option B. Option A is we can make you super intelligent, or option B is we can make you ripped with a six-pack and like huge biceps.
Yeah.
What percentage of people would pick super intelligence, and what percentage would pick like visual enhancement?
Well, what do you think? Because I have a friend, we debate this all the time, and he thinks, because I'm like, okay, everybody's going to be super intelligent because like all the parents are going to be like, I want my kid to be
No,
super
they want a
intelligent.
six-pack.
Exactly. No,
they
so
want to
he's
go. They want to go hook up with people. Like that's what they want. They want the six-pack. Like that's the problem. Is that like that is human nature, right? It is not like let me be super intelligent and like change the trajectory of my family and like do all shit. No, they're like, cool. If I have a six-pack and I go to the beach, like maybe I can find somebody that like will want to sleep with me.
Yeah, but the crazy like this is like I don't know, the almost thing you don't want to admit. The thing is, intelligence is actually correlated with a lot of things. Like intelligence and good looks are correlated.
Well, explain that more.
Which is, if you think about the most intelligent people are usually better looking than people, like on average, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason is, one of the reasons, I mean, there's mutational load and there's other kinds of things. One of the funny reasons is the most beautiful woman mate with the most intelligent men, or just like people who are very competent in getting something done. They were successful. Successful people on average are more intelligent. They get the most beautiful woman. You know what I mean? Like that kind of so you're going to see, I think, and also the most intelligent woman also made with the most intelligent.
There's like
woman,
attrition.
To some exactly. Degree. And that's
so isn't nature already doing what we were talking about earlier in terms of picking the embryos, like the advantageous embryos?
Yeah, yeah. Or I mean, there's a dysgenic effect because they're not having as many kids. So in the sense, nature is not picking. Nature is segregating them, but nature is actually preferring the Like on average, this is like, basic common sense. We know that smart people have fewer babies than like college graduates have fewer babies than high school dropouts or something.
Why do you think that is? Like, what's driving?
That's I think an interesting question, because you see a broader. You see this throughout not just our society, but throughout the world. Like the societies that are poorer have more kids. As societies get wealthier, their fertility like drops off a cliff. I don't think we have a good answer to that. And I think over the long term, it's going to have a big, unless we get, obviously if we already have AGI, who cares about the average intelligence, right? Or if we have human enhancement, the dysgenic effect is not going to be that important. But if that doesn't happen, I think the dysgenic effect is going to be like, by the end of the century, we'll be like a little over 3 IQ points dumber on average than we are now, which doesn't sound like a lot because the average is 100. But a small difference at the mean has a huge impact on the tails. So the number of people who have like an IQ about 130 will get like cut by more than half, especially when the population itself is declining, right? So yeah, I think that's the thing to think about.
When we get these like brain-computer interfaces going to this like human enhancement and intelligence, should we be worried that people who opt out for either ethical reasons or just like they're uncomfortable, like will they just get left in the dust?
Yeah.
Or like what, like how does this work? Or do we get to a point where they're like, yo, everyone has to do this?
We'll just make it like separate reservations for them. They can like live as noble savages.
It's a very crazy thing to think about, right? Where if, let's say it was a cost thing, right? Should the government say, if you don't have the money to enhance your intelligence, then like we're going to help you do that? Like that's going to become a conversation 100%.
Yep.
At the same time, do the people who aren't opting in with their own money, like you're not putting that chip in my brain and like I don't want to participate because my government's telling me to do it?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. There obviously will be a lot of people who reject working with that kind of stuff. I think probably the reality is that they're not going to be that economically or politically important. The opposite hypothesis is that, they're going to be like, they're going to be a minority of economic value. Like most of the economic value is going to generate people who have been enhanced, but they're going to still have, if it's still a democracy, then they're still going to have a lot of political power. And with that political power, they can just like, I don't know, make it illegal or something. But the difficulty is like, how do you make it illegal? Somebody can just get a visa to go to Panama or, Singapore is like some country which allows it. You go do medical tourism. You're actually making it more difficult for that. That means that the elite people can still do it, right? They can just take a trip. But the middle class people who could have actually done it, they might not be able to. So if you just like add regulations, you might actually be making inequality worse. I think genetic redistribution in terms of just giving you these services, I think is probably going to be the answer.
Have you heard, this is going to be a crazy thing that I don't know why I know this. Have you heard of the Brazilian butt lift? You know what this is?
Is it like the thing that Kim Kardashian has?
I'm sure she has it, right? But basically it's a surgical procedure, which I'm not an expert on, unfortunately. But they basically enhance your butt by doing some sort of like butt lift. And I believe that it is, they put similar to like a breast implant or something, right? But in the butt. The reason why I know what a Brazilian butt lift is because one day I was doom scrolling on Twitter, wasting time. And I saw a photo and it was in the Atlanta airport. And somebody had taken a photo and said something to the effect of like, man, these BBLs are really out of control. And I was like, what the hell is a BBL, right? Like, and it was literally, in the photo was just a line of wheelchairs of all like women maybe between the ages of, again, I'm guessing from the photo, but like maybe like 25 and like 40. And I was like, what's going on in Atlanta, right? Like, what's a BBL? And I Google whatever, probably got targeted with 1 million ads of like some dude Googling BBL. And one of the things was that there's been an explosion of medical tourism, I'll put it under the category, of people leaving the United States, going to, I forget, one of the countries in Latin America to get these done, and then they come back. But once you get it done, you can't walk very well. So they need the beginning, they were right after a medical procedure, right? And so what the photo was a bunch of people coming back who were now in a long line of wheelchairs because they all had gone and like from this country and gotten these BBLs. And so I just remember sitting to myself thinking like, holy shit, like this human enhancement stuff is already here to some degree. We think of it as cosmetic, right? Whether people agree with it, don't agree with it, whatever, it's obviously happening. But like, that's what people are interested in.
Yeah.
And so, like, what's the difference between a BBL where you have to fly out of the country to go get it done to, hey, I want to go get a brain-computer interface?
Yeah. I wonder how common those are. Because I don't know, just walking around Miami, I might have seen a few of them. With that, or the girls are just gifted. But
it goes back to society evolves. There's change that happens. And what is aspirational or what is kind of celebrated is emulated through a society, right? And this has been true of human nature for thousands and thousands of years. But that's usually physical. So what clothes you wear, how you look, right? Actions you do, like all that stuff. Intelligence is this weird thing. It's invisible.
Yeah.
You know it when you interact with it and you have heard rumors or somebody can tell you, oh, that person is very smart, or you assume because somebody accomplished something that they are intelligent, but you can't actually feel it. You can't see it. You can't, whatever. I think that that's a huge issue as to why, when it comes to human enhancement, people won't opt for that.
Yeah.
You can't flex your intelligence on Instagram.
Yep. I think you're right. No, I think intelligence is one of the things where we have a difficulty talking about it because we don't want to admit that it's a big part of it's inherited. And then there's actual genetic differences between individuals. Whereas, people know that people look different, right? Like there's differences in height, there's differences even in health genetically. But I think we're going to have to face the biological reality of intelligence when modifying it biologically is going to be possible.
It already is possible to some degree, right? And one of the fascinating debates right now is around like Ritalin or like ADHD, like all this stuff. And it's well documented that like when I was in school, ADHD was not like a popular thing. Now it's like every kid has ADHD. Let's drug them all up.
Every adult has ADHD, apparently. Every adult apparently has ADHD too.
Yeah. And so like, why is it okay for us to like stuff pills down kids' throats, right? And like get them drugged up versus, hey, let's put a computer to make you more intelligent. Like it feels both are going in your body. Yeah, sure. One you digest, one is more of like a surgical procedure. So like there's a severity difference. But it sure seems like it's probably safer in the end state to do the surgery than to keep like putting pills in our children and drugging them up.
Yeah, especially because those are just transient benefits, right? Like you get rid of the drug, you might even be worse off because you've built up tolerance or something. And I don't think there is difficult. I don't think a drug will ever be able to like make you smarter. Maybe may just like those just are stimulants that help you focus, right? But to make you smarter, you actually change the architecture of the brain, and that's not going to be an easy thing to do after your brain is already developed. I don't know how Neuralink stuff will develop, but
yeah.
Whereas I think, I think your brain on Adderall and your brain on embryo selection, there's going to be a big difference.
Yeah. You wrote a piece about the myth of a well-read person. Oh, yeah. What is this?
Yeah. So people have this idea that people don't realize that you can actually know everything.
Okay.
And I have a podcast and I get a chance to talk to these people who have comprehensive knowledge about everything that matters, everything you can know, like Tyler Cowen, Born Hobart, these kinds of people. And there's nothing you could say to them that they haven't already considered. There's no objection that they haven't already looked at, no implication that they haven't already analyzed. And the thing is, these people are just relentless infovores. And if you think about the amount of knowledge you need to understand a subject, right? So take economics, for example. Let's say you read a dozen books about economics, not just random books, but like books that give you a broad explanatory understanding of what's happening. Then you do that for biology. Then you do that for computer science. How long does it take you to read 12 books if you get a serious effort at it, right? You could do this for multiple disciplines in a single year. Now do this for the rest of your life. If you read the right book once every week or something for the rest of your life, you could know 80% about every single field in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And people have this idea that, knowledge is so specialized. You can't there's like new books every single day that you can't possibly ingest all the information. If by information you just mean like you're memorizing trivial details, like you're memorizing the GDP of different Asian countries, like how many ant species there are, yeah, sure, you can't memorize all the information. But just these basic explanatory frameworks, they don't change that often. In fact, if you think there's been a relative stagnation economically and in terms of knowledge recently, they actually are turning over very infrequently. Like quantum mechanics, right? It's like you talk about quantum mechanics, people are like, oh, that's super woo-woo. That's like a new thing in physics. It's 100 years old, right? These things don't change that much. Or like Neo-Darwinian synthesis, 50 years old. Theory of computation, almost 100 years old. So you can learn about these fundamental ideas. And people don't seem to take this prospect seriously, because how many people do you know who are actually making an effort to know everything? I think it's a thing you can do, and I think very few people are attempting it.
Why is it important to know everything?
I think the returns to knowing more things have increased over time. So if you think about like a farmer in the 17th century, right? Even if he knew everything about everything, all the knowledge that was available at the time, what is he going to do with it, right? Like he's not, he only needs to know knowledge about the thing he's particularly working on, like a book on guano farming or tree cutting or something. Whereas today, if you understand, for example, how economic growth works, how finance works, and you also understand, let's say, how nuclear fusion works, and you also understand computer science, you can marriage the software and the hardware parts, you can like build a multi-billion-dollar business, right? Or you can become, like you are, a content creator who's able to synthesize all this information and put it together, and you can have like a huge brand that way. So the returns to knowing about a lot of things in a deep fundamental way have increased a lot over time. Like I think today, Elon Musk is a great example of this. This guy knows a shit ton about, there's stories about he would like show up to parties after the PayPal days, and then he would just like be reading of like a Russian textbook about rocketry or something. That kind of him just having an obsession with learning about different fields, reading textbooks on that, papers on that. That was look at the returns he's had on that, right?
Yeah. It also reminds me of this idea, generalist versus specialist. Yeah. And obviously specialists are very important in certain fields. You know, you want your doctor to be a specialist. You want your lawyer probably to be a specialist, and many other, you know, types of fields. But the generalist, I think society, based on books and articles and even Twitter and the way the conversation plays out, generalist means knowing a little bit about a whole bunch of things. But really what it sounds like you're making an argument for is knowing a good amount about the right things. Yeah. And there's a difference there. It's not just, hey, I've heard of quantum mechanics, right? And I know what field it is in, and maybe I read, you know, a 1-paragraph description one time. But if that is one of the 50 things that matter and are the right things to know about, then can I know 80% or can I know 50% about that field? That's very different than like an inch deep and a mile wide.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point you made, because a big failure mode you can have is when people say generalist, they say like, I'm a generalist, right? Often what they mean is like, I don't have specialty like I don't know that much about any particular thing, but like I don't know, I've like looked into certain things, and I think this is a big problem with not a huge problem, but I think this is something to think about when you're reading these pop sci books. Often they don't give you that deep an understanding of the subject they're talking about. There's really good exceptions to this, but yeah, if you take a serious effort to like actually understanding things, which is very different from...
How do you do it? Like you said, the myth of a well-read person. Yeah. Is it just reading?
No, well, it really helps that I have a podcast, because I can't just passively ingest information. I have to really think about what the point the person is making, what implications their argument has, what contradictions it has. And that, I think, that really helps me make sure that I'm really understanding things in a deep, fundamental way. I really think that the thing I'm trying to do with the podcast, I've had it for, I've been working on it full time for not that long. I'm trying to develop a worldview. And by worldview, I don't mean like a political worldview, I don't, like, you know, who should we vote for in the next election, but just in terms of like where we are in history, what is going to matter in this century, what is going to matter in the long term. Like it sounds vague and ambiguous when you describe it generically, but it requires you to understand a lot of fields deeply, which I don't yet, but I'm trying to. You can't make an assessment on that broader question of where we are in history unless you understand where AI is going, where nuclear is going, where human enhancement is going, where the economy is going, what the rate of economic growth is going to be over time, where how society and culture are going to change over time. You need to understand all these fields. I think there's very few people in the world, and I'm by no means one of these people. I think there's very few people in the world who've actually developed a comprehensive worldview. And I think when they do, it's really remarkable, and those people are really valuable.
So let's just go through this, because this is a fascinating exercise. Develop a worldview is a very intentional action. Yep. I'm going to go develop a worldview. Why is that important? Is it just it makes you a better thinker? It allows you to pick a occupation to go after? Like what is the importance of selecting that as, okay, this is an activity worth pursuing?
Yeah. Well, usually when something is really rare, it often ends up being valuable. If you look at a specialization in academia and other parts of the world, there's very people whose job it is to just think about the whole picture. And so it is a rare thing to do. And you ask like, okay, well, why is it valuable? Just because it's rare doesn't necessarily make it valuable. That's a fair point. But if you look at some of the most successful people in the world, like think of Peter Thiel, right? They say that his hedge fund is basically like a think tank rolled up in a venture capital firm, rolled up in a hedge fund. But it starts off, you look at what he spends his days doing. He's like having seminars on Strauss or Hegel or something. It starts off with these like very fundamental first principles thinking about like very different sectors are headed. I think if you want to find the most important things to work on, which is probably what you should be doing with your career, it would be very strange if you just accidentally happen to work on them. To work on them, you actually need a worldview that first actually points out to you what the most important things to work on are, right? I guess you don't need to obviously it's important to actually start working on the thing itself as well, right? And that's also part of how you develop that worldview. But yeah, to actually focus on the most important things, you need a worldview. And that doesn't necessarily, I'm not just talking about philosophy or humanity stuff. It also requires technical expertise in a lot of fields.
Okay, so you say, I want to go develop a worldview. How do you then choose what are the things that are important within that? Mm-hmm. There's a million topics. You could go to the New York Public Library and walk around and there's section after section after section. How do you know which ones are worth spending time on and which ones do you pass on? Right.
And I think that actually is part of the worldview one of the things the worldview tells you is what is the most important thing. What are the most important things to be focusing on? I think it's very easy to see when something is not going to be the most important thing. I think it's important to take a barbell view of how to think about the most important things are not, if you look at the news, right, it's things that are transient and trivial. People say the news is too pessimistic or it's too optimistic. It's neither optimistic or pessimistic enough. It doesn't focus enough on the upside, the things that are really going to revolutionize the world, new technologies, let's say making steel gets much cheaper. What kinds of new things can you construct? Let's say batteries get much better. What kinds of new robots and stuff, cars, things can be built. It also doesn't focus enough on the downsides. What happens if there's a man-made pandemic, a new lab leak, that kills billions of people, right? What happens if the person who develops AI is somebody like China, where their norms and values are not going to be aligned with ours? So it's not going to be the thing that most people are thinking about, because the thing that most people are thinking about is usually something that people have already looked into. And also it's likely to not be, you're just thinking about, what do people talk about day to day? It's going to be the things that nobody's talking about. But that requires you to, I think it's a good question. I honestly don't have a good answer to where do you start, except just look at everything and try to understand it in a fundamental way.
Mm-hmm. And then once you get into one of the topics, let's just use quantum mechanics as an example and say, hey, I believe that this is an important field to understand better. Yeah. What does that process look like to go from I know nothing to I've got 25, 50, 80% understanding of this field?
Yeah. I actually, learning about quantum computing was a thing that really made me decide that I wanted to do something more interesting with my career, because I was taking Scott Aaronson's probably the greatest living theoretical computer scientist in the world, and I was taking his class on quantum computing. And you think about how quantum computing works. If you take the multiverse view of quantum mechanics, it's literally different branches of the universe colliding to form an answer to a computer science problem you have. It's such an interesting problem, and it's so much more interesting than building the database for Google or something. So how would you learn about that? I think it's important to not get lost in the details, but also to make sure that you're understanding. I think usually the best textbook on a subject are actually pretty good at helping you understand things. Generally, you should do the exercises. You need to. You don't need to memorize trivial details, but you should also understand the actual fundamentals in a deep way.
Yeah. And then when you start to look at I'll call it base knowledge, it's almost like you're going to the source material. So it's the textbook or whatever to learn about the information. You develop this worldview. Are there folks that you think have developed those worldviews that you're like, okay, you mentioned Peter Thiel. Are there others that you say, hey, these folks seem to have figured it out?
Yeah, I think somebody like Bern Hobart Tyler Cowen, there's a few people like this, and the thing is, there's not that many of them. But you ingest their information. Will McCaskill. These people have different worldviews, right? And that's what makes them interesting. It'd be really strange if you just happen to land upon the same worldview if you're both thinking from different premises. They have different worldviews, but the implication of these worldviews means that once they come out of that exercise of thinking about different problems, then they come up with these really interesting problems to work on. Those are some great examples. But like, for example, Will McCaskill is this philosopher who has this new book on long-termism, how to improve the future. And so he just starts from the first premise of, well, let's make sure the future goes well. Okay, what are the things that can matter for making sure the future goes well? Well, one thing is if society collapses, we want to make sure that we can restart society. Okay, well, how do we do that? Well, we would need another industrial revolution if the society collapses. What do we need for an industrial revolution? Well, we would need coal. Right, because coal is the easiest thing to find and burn. Photovoltaics and solar and stuff, they just degrade really fast. Nuclear will degrade over time. So you just need to like dig up some coal and start burning up the furnaces again. Okay, so maybe we should just conserve some easy to access ground coal that's close to the ground. Okay, so just starting from first principles, you come to the conclusion that we need to set up some sanctuaries of coal, right? That's just one example of the strange implications that come from thinking from first principles. Austin Vernon comes from an engineering background. He has this blog that not that many people know about. He comes to this interesting conclusion. He's looking at the declining cost of energy over time. He says, okay, if energy keeps declining over time, at some point it will become economical to take CO2 in the air, in the atmosphere, and use electrolysis to convert that into actual materials used to build things or used as biofuel. It's like ethanol, formic acid, things like that. Okay, once that becomes economical, people are going to start doing that a lot. And once they start doing that, there's going to be a shortage of CO2 in the air, right? Okay, so he starts off this very basic first principle thinking of what is the cost of energy? What are the trends in energy cost? Okay, maybe that means that there's a CO2 shortage in the air, which is much more dangerous than overproduction of CO2.
And does he put a timeline on something like that?
Yeah, it's not super precise, but he thinks by 2100 will be negative carbon in a way that's like substantially negative carbon. I think it's at 2070 actually.
Which goes counter to pretty much the entire mainstream conversation at the moment of we're going to be in the opposite situation.
You know, I think that's really strange, really interesting and strange. If you look at some of the predictions throughout history that people have had, often they've actually identified the correct problem. They get the direction of the vector exactly opposite. Think of population, right? So in the 70s, there's books about how the world population is going gangbusters and, there's going to be overpopulation. And if you think from first principles, it makes a lot of sense, right? The people who have the most babies are going to eventually make up most of the population. Over time, that's going to drive selection towards people who have more babies. And if you have a lot of babies, there's going to be a Malthusian thing where there's not enough food to feed all the people. We'll hit the carrying capacity of the earth, and everybody over that will die of famine, plague, war, all kinds of nasty shit. So first principles, it makes a lot of sense. And they were right that population is the thing that's going to matter a lot. But the thing that actually looks like it's going to be, the trend is going to be that we won't have enough population. The real problem for civilization will be that there's not enough people. And it would be very similar to the carbon. I'm not saying this is likely, but if with the climate change thing, if it turned out that the real problem in 2100 is that there's not enough CO2 in the atmosphere, right? We identified the correct problem, which is going to be the direction of it completely wrong. I think this is an interesting trend.
It's like we didn't even identify the right problem. We identified the right topic.
Yeah.
Right? CO2.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks it's one thing, but they misjudge and it ends up being the opposite problem.
Right.
And, I've said this to you before, but to me, it's you're on the highway and sometimes there's an exit, which it looks like you're just kind of veering off the highway. It's not a very kind of high degree change in direction, right? It's not a 90-degree hit the stop sign, go right. It's just, hey, we're all going together at 65 miles an hour because we follow the speed limit. And then, somebody in the far right lane, they just kind of peel off onto the exit. Some of those exits continue in the similar direction for a little bit, but some exits end up actually being 180 degrees and you basically do a 180, right? You just come around and then you end up going in the opposite direction. And that's what it feels like, which is when you're going down the highway of these ideas, you can actually end up in the far right lane or you can end up in the second to right lane. And that determines, even though it doesn't look like a huge kind of divergence at the onset of the exit, one keeps going straight and one ends up going in the other direction. And so to me, there's a lot of these, right, where we end up seeing it. What I don't know is how do we get people to understand maybe your conclusion is wrong. You have identified the right topic to discuss, but your conclusion is wrong.
Yeah. And to be clear, by the way, I think this is just like a hypothetical future, the climate change thing. I think probably it's more likely there'll be an overproduction of CO2 than
You think so?
well, yeah.
So why do you think his analysis is wrong?
It requires energy to get significantly cheaper than it is now. And I think that's possible, but I'm not sure that, let's say that that's at 50%, right? That energy gets an order of magnitude cheaper. And then you have the probability that, okay, then people will really want to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to do these things instead of like manufacturing these materials another way. That's another probability you got to add. And you just like chain together all the things that have to be true for his vision to be true. Then you get to like something under 50%, right?
Was that the same analysis in hindsight of the 1970s overpopulation? Like you had to believe multiple things.
No, I think you're right. Well, because like their analysis, the people who thought overpopulation was going to be a problem, their analysis was pretty straightforward, right? It's just like people have kids, we have limited amounts of food, so then there won't be enough food and land for them.
And if you were the contrarian in the 1970s, would the analysis have simply been, yes, there are people having a lot of babies today, but as the entire society becomes wealthier and there's like economic mobility, we know that there's less kids in those wealthier families, and so therefore population overall declines, and society across the world, but specifically in the Western world, is naturally mobile upwards.
But how would they have even known that at the time? Because there were very few wealthy societies in the 19th. I think fertility in the U.S. was probably, it was starting to decline because of sexual revolution and stuff. But even as recently as the 50s, obviously baby boomers and stuff, the fertility was super high. So you wouldn't. How would you have possibly predicted back then? Even today, we don't understand why fertility is declining, right? Mm-hmm. So how could you have known before it happened in the 50s that would have happened?
Yeah.
It would have been really tough. And that's another thing about that predicting the future. It's like really hard to know what, we talk about like human enhancement, AI, energy superabundance things. I think probably the most important things are probably things we haven't even realized are going to be really important. I think it's really hard to predict the future.
It's definitely, it's nearly impossible to predict the future, especially across so many different dimensions, right? So again, it goes back to almost being prepared, right, rather than a prediction. Prediction. Can you simply know a deep amount about some good important things, and then you're best prepared to handle whatever comes next, although you cannot predict it, right?
Yeah.
One of the problems that I actually believe has much more impact on society than one, people understand, in terms of severity of problem, but two is how far-reaching the problem or impact is the declining testosterone.
Yeah. Like
10 years ago, no one was really talking about it. Now, I think there's like kind of a subset of the population who says, hey, like red flag, like I think there might be a problem here. My guess is 5-10 years from now, like it'll be a pretty widely accepted, like, why is this happening? Maybe we don't understand it, but like this is a problem. But what's fascinating to me is if you look on the kind of small scale for one single person, the impact of low testosterone versus high testosterone is like completely different people, right? In terms of energy, productivity, sleep quality, health. I mean, like it's so far reaching that it feels like if you then say, okay, across society, it's like we're going to essentially downgrade all of these individuals in terms of performance, quality of life, all this stuff due to lower testosterone. And then we're going to add them all together to make up society.
Yeah.
Pretty important issue that, we don't understand. And we probably underestimate the impact. Like how much of a perceived increase in violence that we see is due to lower testosterone that leads to mental health issues that then leads to violence. Now, again, I'm not making the case that that's what's happening.
Yeah.
But if that 20 years from now, there was an analysis and we could make those connections, we would all be left scratching our heads saying like, holy shit, like no one saw that.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's not right, but who knows?
I think you're if you think about the difference between like a 20-year-old guy and a 40-year-old guy in terms of like their worldviews, what kinds of problems, like how much energy they have, like what kinds of risks they're willing to take. If you think that happens over the entire society turns from like basically the difference between a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old in terms of like being more risk averse. One of the things testosterone does is just makes effort fun.
Yes.
Right. That's why like 20-year-olds will like work, 14 hours, like, in programming, it's like a common thing. Right. And then obviously like it's less common to see that as people get older. And also that's why they're like these examples of like 20-year-olds who like build these huge, obviously it's the median startup founder is older, but a lot of these people who end up becoming huge founders, I don't know, maybe it's like maybe Jeff Bezos is probably like, I don't know, on TRT or something. And
Jeff Bezos today is a little different than Jeff Bezos 1999.
Right.
Yes.
It's kind of insane. He looks younger than 20 years ago. Like I was not alive when he looked older than he looks now.
Yes.
But I think testosterone is really interesting because they've done these experiments on birds. I forget the species, but it's like a monogamous bird species. The males of the species have high testosterone, like just naturally when they're single. When they mate and they form a monogamous pair, and especially after they have kids, their testosterone just goes down, declines by like many factors. So part of that is like you don't want to be this aggressive, risk-taking person after you've already had kids. You want to like make sure things are safe and low volatility once you have kids. But the thing is, there's more single men now. So you would think that testosterone would increase as people being single increases. It's really mysterious. I don't know if you have a good understanding of it. Could be like the receipts and the chemicals. And just this morning I was getting the coffee, and then it was like you got to carry this receipt from here to here. They'll like make you take the receipt.
What is the argument for receipts? I've heard water bottles and things like that, but what is receipts?
I don't remember the exact thing, but like apparently the receipts have some chemical that through your skin has some adverse impact on your testosterone.
So like stop receipts is going to become like a social movement to like get rid of it.
Yeah.
Killing the environment wasn't a big enough deal, right? It's like, but like to fuck with our testosterone when receipts are gone.
Yeah, fuck it, we'll do digital. What do you think it is? Like, why are men's testosterone levels decreasing?
I don't think it's one single factor.
Yeah.
Like these things are usually based on historical examples, like multiple things that come together. I definitely believe it has something to do with water, both from like the tap and also water bottles. I mean, if you just look, we have a bunch of water bottles here.
It's going to turn me into a femboy.
Yeah. Well, if you also think about we were talking earlier today about do you spend more time with your feet on the ground in a standing and walking position, or do you spend more time with your ass in a seat?
Yeah.
Right. And what we're talking about was should you spend more money on your shoes or on the chair you sit in every day? Right. Like in some ways, like people think of like, oh, I want to be comfortable when I'm walking, like they're my everyday shoes. But like the chair you sit in, you actually may spend more time there than with the shoes on. And so same thing goes for consuming liquids. Do you consume more liquids in a water bottle or without a water bottle? Right. And I'm not talking like, people have like these like, I don't know, titanium or whatever thing. I'm talking about like actual plastic water bottles. Like if you start to almost audit your like liquid intake, my guess is people would be shocked at the percentage of water they drink that's out of a water bottle versus something else. Yeah. And so again, there's debate as to, is it actually water bottles? Is it not? Whatever. But like that seems to have some impact to it. The third thing is shit's safe. Like we live in the safest time in human history, right? Like you don't need to be worried for the most part, right? That when you walk down the street, someone may try to kill you. You're not worried about a wild animal, again, for the most part, coming into where you sleep and killing you at night. You're not worried about going out and hunting for food. And so just naturally, I think humans evolve. And so like you get some drop. That doesn't explain the significant drop in the last 20 years, but definitely the longer term trend. And then I think that there's a social thing. And this is where people get real weird and they don't like talking about it. But like, there is a very obvious, at least to me, trend of masculinity being maybe not deterred, but definitely adding more friction to encouraging that. And so you can see it in the type of content that is created from, Hollywood and things like that. You can see it in social media and kind of sentiment changes, but also you can just see it in like what we ask of people in society. And some of this is not like a man thing. If we are a society that says, okay, we used to be 100% capitalism, and now maybe we're like, capitalism is good, but like now there's some times where like socialism is good, right? And we don't say it that way, but like that's what ends up happening. What it does is it dulls, right? I think dulling is a good word because you don't take away certain aspects socially. What you're doing is you're dulling the self-reliance, the independence, the like kind of characteristics that for thousands of years masculinity was very similar to. And so when you start to look at it, it's like you can't point to any one thing, and you can't even point to one thing in the last 20 years necessarily. It's all of this stuff coming together. And so if you said to yourself, like, forget like maybe water and plastics and things like that, like what would have the rate of decline been anyways? Right. And how had it fallen from, I don't know, 1000 AD, right, to like 1500?
Yeah. No, I think if you look at the history of violence throughout history, where else would you look? You see, I think it's a good thing that you see a huge declines in violence over time. Even if you look at the time that testosterone has been decreasing, let's say the last few decades, look at like crime rates in the 90s, look at crime rates now, there's been a recent resurgence, but over time crime rates have been like dropping a lot. I think that probably has to do with the fact that there's low testosterone. Just read the Iliad or the Odyssey or something, like people are constantly getting butchered. And I think that probably was not just the story. I mean, the thing itself was a story, but I think that was an indication of the kind of society these people lived in terms of the ever-present nature of violence. Of genocide, of war. And so, maybe the way to think about declining testosterone is just as like declining volatility, in the sense that, yes, you'll have fewer criminals if there's less testosterone, but you'll also have fewer Jeff Bezos and Elon Musks, because one of the things that drives them, at least when they were young and building up their career capital, building up their skills, is I'm guessing the average startup founder probably has more testosterone than the average person.
I was going to ask, I wonder if you could break down the person who takes the job at Google versus the person who starts a company, right? And you did an entire study. The expectation, I think, again, you'd have to run the experiment to know, would be that the startup founder would have higher testosterone, right, than the person who took the job at Google. And then I wonder if there was even a difference between the successful founder and the not successful founder, right? Now, some of it's outside their control. There's market conditions. There's all this type of stuff. But if there was a difference, it would be interesting. And you can imagine the backlash to a study that if it got to the conclusion and linked higher testosterone levels with higher success, there would be fucking chaos, right? People would be like, oh, that's bullshit, whatever. Because then all of a sudden the question would become, rather than sticking computers in people's brains, like it's the first step, hey, don't drug people with Ritalin, like instead just like hand out testosterone to people, right? Like
all I'm saying is look at the Amazon stock price in the last 5 years. That's all I'm saying. But regarding the chemicals in the water, there's these bloggers, Slime Time Old, that have been looking at the increase in obesity over the last few decades. And their theory, it's not just like people are eating shittier food. It's also that maybe there's chemicals in the water, and they're trying to figure out what it is, that are causing this increase in obesity. And one of their pieces of evidence is if you look at places that are higher in elevation, like places like Colorado, they have lower obesity rates than places that are lower in elevation and next to rivers. So think of like Louisiana or Texas or something. Those places have higher obesity rates. So if it's just like runoff of chemicals, that's exactly what you'd expect.
But how much of it is just like people in Colorado like to go outside, and people in Louisiana, the generalization would be like they go, to Mardi Gras and eat fucking fried chicken.
No, I think that's probably the good null hypothesis. Like I think that's also good.
Well, and food is a fascinating thing. So there's a small town in North Carolina that I drove through 2 years ago or so. And when we were driving through, Polina said to me, she goes, wow. I was like, what? She's like, look. And we were at a red light, and we could see kind of through the town. And there was, I don't know, maybe 3 lights or so, 4 lights, right? And it's next to a highway. So it's like right off the exit of the highway. Every single place that you could get food was completely unhealthy. Mm-hmm. McDonald's, Wendy's, all these things. And then it was like Cracker Barrel, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, like, every single thing. And it was like, if you live in this town, other than go to the grocery store, there's not a single thing from what we could see that was a healthy option.
Yeah.
And so low cost, convenient, and the abundance of options, right, ends up leading people to bad health and diets. But also, when you layer in some of this other stuff of sedentary lifestyle, whatever, and then you've got the genetics on top of it, like it just stacks on top. And I actually think for the average American living in a small town, the deck is completely stacked against them. Doesn't mean it is not possible to live a healthy lifestyle, to be in shape, to do all this stuff. But like, it sure as hell ain't easy. And so that then I think is also a contributor. Like you have the stuff in the water, but like you sure aren't optimizing your testosterone if you're eating McDonald's every day.
Yeah.
Right. And so how much is food? How much is water? How much is social? Like there's a lot of stuff in there that just ultimately leads to, man, testosterone's going down and like we probably should try to figure it out.
Yeah. And I think probably obesity is maybe the most important. If you think about like what is the thing that's the biggest factor to testosterone declining, I wouldn't be shocked if it's just obesity. Like people are fatter. I think fat, if I remember correctly, becoming fatter decreases your testosterone or increases your estrogen or something like that. Because obviously like the fat stores hormones. But yeah, I think this is not just testosterone, but this is like a broader thing about society over time becoming more complacent. And part of this is testosterone declines, but if you look at like new businesses that are created, you hear about these stories of startups and, Uber, Facebook, Google. Actually, over time, if you look at the number of new businesses that are created, it's been declining over time. As people get wealthier, you have more regulations, you have a bigger welfare state. Maybe these things make sense at some level, but also maybe it's like you're the casino, you're like one big, if you're like a wealthy country and you're like, okay, I'm just going to cash it in. And so I'm not going to have economic growth, but I'm just going to like redistribute the wealth we already have. That's basically what you're doing, right? You're like leaving the casino. But yeah, it is concerning that over time, wealthy societies become stagnant and complacent like this, where they have regulations that make growth really hard. There's, I guess, like even hormonal changes, like literally the testosterone goes down over time.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
You wrote a piece about popularizers or intellectual market makers. What do you mean by popularizers? And then what is this idea of like an intellectual market maker?
Yeah. So if you think about what a market maker does, right? A market maker is somebody who provides a service in the market. You go like Robinhood or something. You can see that you can like buy any stock you want anytime you want. Why is that possible? It's because there's somebody who provides a service where they're going to buy your stock at, let's say, $1.01. They're going to sell it at 99 cents. They're going to make 2 cents of money off of that. So you're paying a little bit of fee to them to provide liquidity to take it off your hands anytime you want. And so you don't have to like wait for another counterparty to come around to be able to sell that stock. I think if you think about what popularizers do, so think like public intellectuals, pop site book writers. I think they actually provide a very similar service in the intellectual sphere. So you think of somebody like Malcolm Gladwell, right? How did he achieve his notoriety? Well, one of the things is he takes this undiscovered study about hockey players and their birthdays, and he converts it into this New York Times bestselling book called Outliers. And then he makes money off that spread. Right. And the thing about market makers is they provide an actually useful service. So it's useful to both all three counterparties. Similar with like Gladwell brought up the profile of this guy who wrote a study about hockey players. He brought like a useful book to consumers and he's making money off that spread. And people degrade these kinds of popularizers. Oh, it's like alterative, right? You hear talk about like Yuval Noah Harari's book. It's like, oh, these are ideas people already had. I think people miss the point that if you don't have these intellectual market makers, if you don't have these public intellectuals, you don't have liquidity. The market makers provide liquidity, right? So you don't have liquidity in the intellectual marketplace. And if you don't have liquidity, ideas can't be exchanged. There's not as much turnover in ideas. People aren't exposed to ideas. Just if you didn't have market makers, you couldn't like easily buy stocks off Robinhood. So people, when you think about it this way, you understand the value that these popularizers are providing. You don't just think of them like, oh, they're just like regurgitating information.
The idea of a popularizer being an intellectual market maker is not new. Like you've said it in a way that is new.
It is itself an example of intellectual market making.
Well, guess who is probably the world's most famous popularizer? Thomas Edison.
Oh, interesting. Say more.
Thomas Edison's entire model was that he would go find young, incredibly smart innovators, get their ideas, bring them in, fund them, and then help popularize those ideas. So Edison didn't create electricity. Edison didn't create, all these different things. But in some way, it was a cross between, like, in today's society, Y Combinator and, like, Joe Rogan's podcast coming together to help discover, fund, operationally, increase productivity, and then popularize the idea. And so in some way, it wasn't write a book, right? It was more so like what we would consider action or productivity. But like at the end of the day, like that was what the business he was in.
Yeah. It's also sort of like Peter Thiel, right? Like him scouting out talent. It's like he's basically market making between the talent he scouts and the companies he creates and, funds. So yeah, actually that's a really interesting way to think about people who spot talent and who spot new ideas, new innovators.
If you have to choose between finding somebody who is high performance, high intellect, outlier potential, or like high volatility, as we talked about earlier, or somebody who is well-versed at management and all this stuff, the difference between the best investors in the world and the top quartile is that the best investors will pick the high volatility person.
Interesting.
Not the high management person.
How do you find people who are high volatility? What is it about their past, about their presentation that you can tell this person's gonna...
The pattern, there almost is no pattern, which is why they're high volatile. And probably the place that I find the most of them is on Twitter.
Interesting.
And they're usually talking about stuff that they almost never have a lot of followers. Right, or a lower amount than you would expect. They're usually talking about weird things, and they usually you can tell if you read through their tweets, they are high volatility. Like there's times where you can tell, like, okay, this is like maybe in the content there's volatility. So like they're talking about this one extreme thing, then they're talking about another extreme thing, then they're talking about this other, and like you're like, oh, this is kind of all over the place. But you realize it's because they're like a curious person or they're like high intelligence, they're trying to learn or whatever. There's volatility from an emotional standpoint. So there's, they get really excited, they get not so excited. And like that high emotion volatility ends up being something that you can tell if somebody's tweeted enough or something on Twitter. And then when you talk to them, you definitely can. And then also, I think that you can tell based on ambition. So if you talk to somebody for long enough, you can tell high volatility to the upside in terms of they're very, very ambitious about some things. And then there is almost a complete counterbalance in that they are so disinterested and completely bored by things that actually usually society would be super excited about. So like a good example would be, I want to solve this really, really hard problem and I don't care if I make any money. Right. And you're like, man, those are two different ends of kind of the goal, spectrum. And most people optimize for the money. And like, if it happens to be a hard problem, then like, cool, that's intellectually stimulating. So there's a bunch of different frameworks. And I think that what you end up just realizing is it's kind of like a volatility index. Like when the VIX spikes, like shit's getting crazy. People have like a personal VIX score almost, right? And you just talk to them and you're just like, this person is within this like narrow band or this person is not within the narrow band. And like not being in the narrow band, again, like can have many different outcomes. It could be like genius, moron, right? Like insane, rational optimist. But I think over time, people have who look for these types of folks, they just realize like the one thing that everyone is certain is avoid the people within the band because that's not where the outlier outcomes are. Right.
Yeah. And one worry you could have is we have institutions that homogenize so much that you're not reducing the median value of somebody who like goes to Harvard maybe increases, like maybe they're learning valuable skills. But if you've gotten rid of the tail outcomes, and if most of the value comes from those tail outcomes, then you've actually done something very bad. This guy wrote a really interesting, you can ask the question of like, why are there when Shakespeare was around, the human population was like less than 1 billion. It was like significantly less when Shakespeare was around. And, he's like said to be the greatest writer of all time. Or just go back to like Einstein, Edison. These people were around, the human population was a lot lower. And these people were just like super outliers. These kinds of people almost don't seem to exist today, right? Like there's no writer who's as good as Shakespeare. There's Elon Musk is like inventors as good as Edison, but like scientists is as good as Einstein, right? And one thing that could be happening is you have institutions that, if you think of like writers, they go to like Masters of Fine Arts, right? Okay, and they live in Brooklyn. So everybody who could be writing a really brilliant book, they're not out there like Melville, like becoming fishermen or something, and they're like getting exposure to an idea that gives them the idea to write some like magnum opus on, they're just like, they're literally living the same lifestyle as everybody who's trying to do the same thing. Same with like going to Harvard, right? Same network, same ideas, same skill set. So if we're reducing the volatility of verticalization through these kinds of homogenizing institutions, I think we make a mistake by just saying like, oh, the median hasn't decreased. You're forgetting that somebody asked an interesting question like, why do we only have one Elon Musk? There should be like 1,000 of them going around. Like, what happened to the rest of them, right? Did we just kill off the tail of that kind of outcome and then only one of them survived, whatever filter we had there? Yeah.
I think that we probably have more than one. There's just one who lined it all up.
Yep.
Ambition, capital, network, courage, right? Like it takes a lot of different things, but there's probably other people like that. And, you could look and say ambition is like a great one. What's ambitious to one person is not ambitious to another person. Mm-hmm. And in many cases over history, there's been people who have been highly ambitious and have come to conclusions that ended up being really important, but at the time they were laughed at, right? I'm going to forget the name of the person, but there's an individual who the world is round, but the rest of the solar system does not revolve around the Earth; it revolves around the sun. Mm-hmm. It was killed for it.
Yeah. Was it Copernicus?
I forget.
Okay.
And so when you think of that, like now we're like, duh, yeah. Right? But at the time, crazy. You're insane. So it then begs the question, like, what insane thing exists today that you actually think is more likely right than wrong? And so there's things that probably in the tech world we think of, around solving problems or whatever, but there's probably countercultural things in society that seem absolutely fucking bananas. And then 20 years from now, 30 years, 50 years, during our lifetime, we'll be like, oh, I can't believe we didn't realize that.
Yeah. I do wonder, there's this movement of like trad. I don't know if you've seen this stuff.
No, what is it?
Basically like living like people lived like many decades or centuries ago, but with like modern technology.
How would you do that?
Well, it's not like Amish. Like you still adopt modern technology, but you also have, I guess, more traditional lifestyles in terms of like gender what? Norms or just like what kinds of careers you choose, things like that. So
you still have like a cell phone, you still have electricity, you still have whatever,
right?
But it's
you have like a lot of kids or something.
Okay,
yeah, and yeah, it sounds weird. Actually, that's not even that novel, but I do think that the way we like organize families and communities today, there is an element to it, which is maybe over time it will seem like that was like a really isolating way to live. And if your ancestors could see how you live, they'd be super anxious about the fact that you're just like alone most of the day, right? When they're trapped in a house. What you were telling me about, going to the Tenement Museum in New York, like 10 people in a small room. Okay, maybe that's too much, right? But then just like millions of people living in an apartment by themselves, that also probably sounded a bit dystopic to them from the opposite perspective. Mm-hmm. And also probably the free to cheap information that you consume on your phone, some of that they would not approve of, right? So I think over time, like the way we think of, I wouldn't be surprised if fundamentally some of the ways we like live, organize families, communities today would be looked at in the future as, that was like a really isolating and weird way to live at the time.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And it also, if you look at a lot of society's problems, like probably could be boiled down to like a great way to solve it would just be better parenting. Like you ever see like a news story and you see somebody doing something and you're like, man, if that person had a certain type of parent, like they'd smack them in the face, right? Just be like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And again, that's not the solution to everything, right? But like that is the proxy for there's definitely something there around family, parenting, the way people are raised, like all this stuff. And like some of it's positive, right? Like there is this element of the way that some people were raised 50 years ago was actually bad for the kid, right? Like it fucked them up as they grew up. But then there are some other things that like, hey, maybe we need more, discipline or whatever. And some of it's a story as old as time. Like how many different decades was the story like, oh, young, energetic, lost, unorganized man joins military, gets disciplined, becomes productive member of society. Like that's just a story that has always existed for a long time. But there's other examples of it in society. And so like, I always go back to just like, again, how many of the problems are fixed or addressed via social means versus legal versus like technology. And the truth is that like actually a lot of our problems in society that are like fundamental problems that people feel on a day-to-day basis, they're not technology problems. They're usually these other things.
Yeah. But parenting, by the way, is one thing where I have like, where I think we're really doing a bad job. In some ways, it's like much better than the past, right? Like kids are not getting like beaten or something. So actually there was, Dan Carlin has a book on history where he says, I think he estimated that like more than half the kids who have ever lived were like sexually abused or another way like physically abused because I forget what his evidence was. But yeah, like I think there's some pretty dark things if you look back at history, like how kids were treated. So in many ways, we've like made a lot of progress. But I think one thing, I had this lady come on my podcast. She's the founder of a movement called Taking Children Seriously. And the idea is, if you think about the way we treat children in terms of the rights we give them, if you treat an adult this way, it would just be a huge infringement on somebody's own personal autonomy, like trapping a 16-year-old in a government building from 9 to 5 in this like basically this prison. And if you look at the outcomes of education, like it's basically useless.
It's 100% prison for most kids.
Yeah.
Not every kid. There's a reason why traditional education is important for certain occupations stuff, but you're telling a child sit down and shut up for 8 hours a day.
Right.
Like that's not natural.
It gets even darker if you listen to these stories about Chinese education. There's this guy has a doorman. He has a great review of this book called Literal Children, where he talks about this lady. She like moves from America to China, and her kid is like enrolled in a Chinese preschool. And like there's the crazy. One of the things that happens is he's forced to draw raindrops or raindrops. But it's like hours a day. They had to be the exact same shape and form. And if you like mess up, you like try to like actually make the figure different in any way, they punish you. Or one time, her kid was just he hated eggs, so the school like fed the kids eggs, and the kid really hated eggs. So they like physically force feed him eggs so that he can get over his aversion. And when the mother goes to the teacher and she's like, "Yo, what the fuck are you doing?" The teacher's like, "Never talk back to a teacher ever." Like the adults have complete authority. The children are treated like shit. So, but even if you think about it, like, if you look at the outcomes of education in the U.S., right? If you ask people who have taken Spanish in high school or middle school, just like remember anything about Spanish,
Hola.
Right? I took 4 years of Spanish in high school. I was in Mexico City. I barely remembered anything. But just like stuff like how many years of civics education? People always talk about like we need to increase civics education or something. How many years of civics education and history are you already giving the kids? And if you look at like polls, if you ask people what are the 3 branches of government, or like how many branches of government do we have? It's like a small minority know that. So education is just like completely useless or mostly useless outside of just like the basic numeracy and literacy. And we're forcing kids to be miserable for hours a day.
Social control as well. Like, what do you do with the kids, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like in some way, many parents look at school as almost like a babysitter, right? It's like, I got to go to work. And again, you can't lose the other side of this equation, which is like, if the parents couldn't go to work because they had to watch their kid, like that's not an option. They got to go to work. So then it's like, okay, well, what is the cost to doing something with the child while you're at work?
Yeah, that's why I'm a fan of child labor.
Child labor?
Yes.
All right, explain this. Oh, Jesus. Today's episode is brought to you by Alto IRA. Have you wanted to buy Bitcoin or over 200 other cryptocurrencies in your retirement account? Well, now you can with Alto IRA. They allow you to buy Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in a tax-advantaged way. There's no account or setup fees, and it's super simple to get started. You can go today to altoira.com/pomp to get started. altoira.com/pomp. Invest in Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in your retirement account and get all the tax advantages while still holding digital currencies. altoira.com/pomp.
So when people talk about child labor, they think about the last time child labor was legal, which was when they were like getting their hands burned off in some cotton factory. You know what I mean? Like some textile factory.
Sweatshop and Nike in China.
But like...
And Nike doesn't do that. they claim.
Yeah. So that's what they think of, right? But that's not what jobs are today. Like the adults at the time were doing the same kind of work. Today, it's like he would work at a donut shop or he would like work at McDonald's or Walmart or something. And I would claim that the skills you learn at McDonald's, actually, I think this is actually something they do really well. Where it's like showing up on time, being responsive, having like social skills, having like self-control. I would say that that's more valuable than any given day in like a public education system.
So I agree, except for I'm going to twist this one way. I would look at it less as like go work at McDonald's, go work at Walmart or whatever. And I think, again, I have an 8-month-old daughter, so I'm like actively thinking through, but I've got time to kind of figure out, how to handle this. I sum it up as like apprenticeship.
Yep. No, I agree.
Like apprenticeship model feels like a great way for people to learn without the downsides of like sit down, shut up, don't talk for 8 hours, right? And when you say this whole like taking kids seriously, type movement, it's just treat them like an adult, and I think they begin to emulate what adults do. Right? Like if you treat a kid like a 1-year-old kid, and you're constantly telling them no and this and that, like they just act exactly like you're treating them.
If you treated a 25-year-old like you do a 14-year-old, and you also I guess they didn't realize they were 25. I don't know. It's a weird thought experiment.
No,
but you know what I mean?
Still, if you still treat them like they're 14, they revert towards the actions of a 14-year-old.
Which also raises the possibility that if you treated 14-year-olds now like they were 25, right? So that, basically they're the beginning of their career. Not that they're like stuck in this infant primordial state of constantly getting more education in ways that don't seem related to any obvious career. But just like, okay, you're 14, you're going to get an apprenticeship. You're going to like go intern at some, like a programming firm or finance or whatever, right? Like you're going to like actually get if you look through history, you look at how education worked in how like careers worked in, let's say, like medieval times or something. It was like you apprentice for the person you want to become in your career.
Of course.
And parents would pay the person for the privilege of having their child work for them. Because they realize that the education, like the first-hand education, is way more important. There actually is a scientist, I forget his first name, but it's called the 2 sigma problem, where he discovered that one-on-one tutoring is 2 standard deviations more effective than the current education system where you have like 20 kids in a school. So just if you just had replaced current school system, just like you give everybody an apprentice. The problem is the way that the way that the labor market regulations work here, like with internships that are unpaid, the law literally says you're not allowed to get any economic value from them. If you get economic value from them, you're not allowed to have them be an unpaid intern. But they're getting value they're getting experience, which is like super valuable to them. That's not legally allowed for you to give them that experience. And it's, so basically this puts a huge drag on people who would use this as like a lever to climb up in their...
Warren Buffett, right? Like somebody asked him, hey, can I come work for you for free? And he said, no, that'd be too expensive for me, right? Like you're taking my time, right? Which kind of fits along this. But yeah, I just think... If you took a 14, 15-year-old kid, by the way, I was a shithead 14-year-old kid, right? And most, especially young boys, but most kids their brains aren't formed, like they act like idiots, right? They got too much energy, like all these things. But I'm willing to bet I would have learned more if you said to me, hey, every 6 months, you're going to go, you're going to work at this place, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. And you could say, okay, cool. When I was 14, there was like 3 or 4 things I thought could be cool, potential like job paths. And you say, cool, you're going to go spend, every day for, every weekday, you're going to go spend with these people and you're basically going to have this apprenticeship and you're just going to do whatever they need you to do. And at the end of 2 or 3 years, I probably would have a pretty damn good education from like real world exposure, but also I'd probably know better as to what I was most interested in. And so like, are we doing people a disservice by putting them through high school, they graduate and then it's like go to college and like figure it out in college? Well, like, where you go to college, pretty damn important, decision.
Or what you study.
Whether you go to college or not, pretty damn important decision, right? And so you just don't have any exposure really because, every once in a while I get an email from somebody who's like a high school senior and they're like, hey, I want to do like a summer internship or something. And I'm like, okay, but there's like no model for that. And by the time you're a senior, that summer is like the summer before you go to college. You already made all those decisions. Yeah. So like, what if you were like a freshman or sophomore?
Yeah.
And different.
The crazy thing is not only that are you forced to kind of decide on those kinds of things when you're pretty young, in a way that is, you had to do it without the experience of what those careers are like. But the amount of time it takes to go through that process, like if you talk to a smart kid in high school and you're like, okay, how long did it take you to apply to colleges and stuff? It is a huge bureaucratic, time-consuming process. These kids could otherwise be spending time doing a whole bunch of cool side projects that are going to be really help their career. I mean, in programming, it's like you start a GitHub account in your high school and you start programming some things. People are going to notice and they're going to be impressed, right? It's like a proof of work. You don't have time for that if you're applying to colleges and writing these bullshit essays. Where you got to pretend that you're going to the college for a reason other than the obvious reason you go to a prestigious college, which is you want to make a lot of money, right?
Did you see maybe it's Morgan Housel. Somebody on Twitter recently was like, high school, like you fail because you didn't meet the 10-page minimum essay requirement. Like real world, promotion, you sent me a 2 bullet point email, right? Or like whatever it was. And it was basically just like, what are we talking about here, right? Is you actually in the professional world get rewarded for being able to communicate clearly and concisely.
Yep.
But somehow, like we all did it in high school. I'd be like, all right, how do I do like 1.5 space, right? Like, they're going to be able to tell 12 point font versus 12.5 font, right? like, can we play with the margins? Like you play, like, you're just like, I'm literally wasting time, right? Doing dumb shit. To try to meet some, made up requirement.
Yeah. I think over time, hopefully there will be more ways to signal that. If you think about what is education signaling, right? The main reason you go to college is sending a signal to future employers. And that signal is, I'm intelligent, I'm conscientious, I can work hard, I can do like tasks that are kind of boring and maybe not directly useful. I can just work hard at them, and I'm conformist, right? Which is like a thing that probably employers care about. It has a negative connotation, but it's like, I'm not gonna like, like disrupt the workplace or something. Hopefully there's ways to signal intelligence, conscientiousness early on and better than college. And if that happens, the whole oligopoly we have of education, the schools that receive federal funding are the ones that get to determine if another school can receive federal funding for education. It's a total, just a total oligopoly. Anyways, so if for programming, let's say your GitHub resume becomes more important than where you went to college, which it should be, right? Like what you can actually do, there's a clear, legible signal of that. Then hopefully the power of these, like people won't feel forced to go attend like a 4-year university degree that way. There was actually I had this guy on the podcast, Scott Young. I don't know if you've seen, he did something called the MIT Challenge, where if you look at MIT's curriculum in all its courses, to their credit, they've made it all open source. So all the lectures, all the exams, they're all open source. So he's like, okay, let me see if I can speed run MIT's computer science curriculum. In 1 year, he goes through all 4 years of CS classes at MIT. I think he was going at an insane pace. It was like 1 class a week. It just like worked all day, all night at it. And he would self-administer the exams. And like, if he would like, as long as he didn't fail those exams and those homeworks, he would like say, I graduated this course. And so he did that. It took him a year, and he got like all kinds of insane programming job offers after that. Cause like that's a novel, volatile thing to do. Mm-hmm. People notice that. It's almost a better signal than actually going to MIT. Hopefully over time, you can do more of those kinds of things.
There is like 2 years of work in 4 years of college, maybe 2 years.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of bullshit that goes on.
I would be surprised if it's 2 years. Like that sounds like way too much.
Yeah, I got an economics degree, which at the time I selected one because it was going to be the shortest path to getting a degree, but also I had some intellectual interest in it. I think you had to take 8 credits. There's like 8 classes.
Jesus.
Now you had to meet other requirements or whatever. You know, they fill it out to make it so it's not just, hey, take these 8 classes. But yeah, like that was it.
Yeah. The unfortunate thing is they're adding, at least at my university, this didn't happen with me. They're adding like more bullshit classes you had to take as like a general curriculum kind of thing. Like one of the things they're going to force you to take in the future is sustainability classes or something. And we already had to take global diversity or global culture, you know, just like all kinds of these things. It's like kind of political propaganda classes you had to take. So yeah.
It sounds good to the board of trustees.
Right. And then you think like, well, what is the actual value we're contributing to the student? Yeah. I made it a point of principle. I never read a book I was assigned in school.
That's a pretty good strategy. I mean, look, there's good books that people may discuss, but for the most part, they're probably not the ones that you're interested in, right? Yeah. It's I don't know. It's a weird thing. Would you do college again?
That's an interesting question because you have to approach it from the perspective of not knowing what I know now, but I know now even if I forgot everything I know about computer science, I know now how I could teach myself those things or what kinds of opportunities and networking things I could do to give myself a leg up and go through things I've gone through much faster. I wouldn't know that when I was 17. And I also wouldn't know, I don't know if I'd have the discipline and the conscientiousness, frankly, to go through that kind of stuff. So I probably would still go through college, but I think if I had a different kind of degree, I probably wouldn't. And if I could like know what I know now about just like how to learn, I wouldn't go through college.
Yeah. I'd go for the parties.
Yeah.
Like the social experience, right?
Yeah.
The education, I mean, maybe it helped. One of my favorite experiences from college, I got deployed halfway through school. So I came back. And so I walked into some kind of government or politics class, whatever it was. And all of a sudden, somehow, like the Middle East came up. And I was sitting there and, my strategy was like, just don't get noticed in class. And probably didn't take it nearly as seriously as I should have or I would now. But the teacher started saying all kinds of like crazy shit about the Middle East and like U.S. relations, like all this stuff and everything. And one of my buddies was sitting next to me and he like tapped me and he was like, what do you think? And I was like, it's all bullshit. And then of course, like a fucking jackass, right? He raises his hand. He goes, well, he was just there. So like he could tell us a little bit. I was like, dude, fuck off. And so like, it was fascinating though, because like, that was like, again, that was one specific instance in, what ended up being 5.5 years total from start to finish. But like, I probably was better versed, like me personally, than the teacher talking about that one part of the class. And then it made me think. I was like looking around the room and we had people from all walks of life, like all these different things. And I was like, well, what do you think? Right? Like, what do you think? Like, why can't we make this less of like a lecture where it's one person who's up there who's just been a teacher their whole life? Why don't we all talk? And I bet you I'm going to be able to learn a lot more from some of these people than I am from the teacher. And so some of it's like college itself. And then some of it is just like even the mechanisms that just like replicate what was high school. Because it's different in high school. Yes, you could learn from your classmates and stuff, but like the world experiences aren't nearly as well developed as maybe by the time you get to college. And if you have like freshmen and seniors that are together, right, in a class, it's very different than like, I don't know how many freshmen in high school are learning a lot from their freshman classmates, except for if it's somebody who comes from a different culture, a different place, maybe has different life experience, but like, that's not nearly as much as they've only been around for 14 years, right? Yeah. Of which you probably remember, less than 10. So like, how much could you really have done? And then be able to articulate those ideas is a little different.
Right. What was the experience like going from these like life and death situations in the military, then to transitioning to college where it's a little bit contrived, kind of, just like it doesn't seem as visceral as being in a military situation.
So I was in college, got deployed, then came back to college.
Right.
So it was like,
what was the transition like before and after?
Going there, it wasn't real at first.
Yeah.
Like I've told the story before, but was in college. I was playing football. Went and got deployed, and so like you kind of almost feel like it's almost like a game a little bit. And then the first time that there was like a major event while I was there, somebody got killed, and you then get to the situation like, oh, this is real, right? It's like it changed the perspective. But then coming back, I was there with a lot of older guys. So I was 20, I turned 21 in Iraq. These guys, probably the average age was like 27, 28. And so many of them married, kids, had a house, like just like life shit, right? I was worried about like, what's the party on Friday night? Like a couple of weeks before. These guys were really worried about like, how do I pay my mortgage? How do I take care of my kids? Like whatever. So like you just like naturally mature in a weird way, like apprenticeship, right? Like you get exposed to certain things. And then when I came back, like there was actually like a very barbell response. So on one side, you're a 21-year-old kid who went to war and came back. Like you are invincible, right? Fucking do all kinds of crazy stuff. On the other side, you're like, man, like I should take school more seriously, right? Like I'm going to be here. There's a real world after this. And so like I became much more serious about like more like intellectual things or whatever.
Interesting.
And so like that's like a weird balance. Because you're like, hey, you come back and like I got a motorcycle and would fucking fly around and like act like an idiot, right? And like not from a sense of like I was doing anything that was endangering other people or whatever, but like I would go fast on a motorcycle. And right, and it's like because like you just felt, implicitly like, you can do anything. At the same time, though, you become more serious about like, hey, I actually want to learn here. Right. Yeah. And so it was weird, too, because I also came back and I was only there for one semester with everyone I'd gone through college with. Then they graduated. So now I was with myself and like a bunch of younger people. Right. And they're not that much younger, 2 years or whatever. But now all of a sudden, like you're the old person. Right. And then like in a college environment, the age bracket is like 18 to 22. Yeah. So if you are on the higher end of that and you're around, 18, 19-year-olds, like that's a pretty big psychology gap, like all this stuff. And then the life experience and all that. And so it was the first time in my life that I kind of was just like, oh shit, we all die, we all get old, we all like do all this stuff. And so it just added a layer of like seriousness, I think, of just like, all right, like you don't get to just party and act like an idiot in college forever. You have to like go into the real world. And so like to some degree, like if more people got, not to go to war, but like could understand that, I bet you people would take it more seriously.
Yeah. How old were you when you got back?
I came back, I was 21. Oh. So I went at 20, turned 21 overseas, then came back.
Gotcha.
I was 21.
Yeah. No, that's, but when you are in college, like you notice the difference between somebody who is like a freshman and senior. And then if you punctuate that with a super intense experience, super life-forming experience, like going to the military, it just, the psychology, like your discipline, your motivation, what you think is important. I can't imagine like the difference.
Well, just think 18 to 22 of like an average college student difference. And then imagine a 24-year-old who has 2 years of work experience.
Yeah.
Like the 18 to 22 was already a crazy jump. 22 to 24 is actually a pretty crazy jump with 2 years of life experience. Then go 18 to 24, it's like, kid versus, young adult, right? Like it's completely different. And so I think those years are like some of like the highest volatility years, right? And I don't actually know, this is very interesting. I don't know very many people who took, we'll call it the like safe path out of college that reverted back.
Interesting.
To like high volatility
that's super
decisions later.
Because that's really interesting. And I'm curious why that is. Because in tech, you'll notice a lot of people will say when they graduate college, I'm going to work in Google for a few years. I'm going to start my own startup. I'm only saving up enough money that I have a nest egg. Maybe I can like have a few months of runway. And none of those people.
Some of them start companies. They just start the safe company. Yeah. They start the like, hey, I worked at Google for 5 years and now I'm going to work on ad optimization startup. Like, cool. But none of them go and like, I'm going to build a nuclear power plant. Yeah. Right. Or very like, there's always the exceptions to the rule. But like, there seems to be over time a diminishing return to the high volatility kind of path. And so if you're not going to do it when you're young, you're almost never going to do it when you're old, except for external shock.
Right.
Some life event happens and you like get shaken out of one path and then you go on another one.
Right. And that I think is where like being in the military when you're young, I don't have the experience, but like I can imagine how valuable that experience would be, because that's a time when you're like, your brain is kind of still very plastic, and you could accumulate that experience in a way that like changes your personality, which wouldn't be possible later on. I wonder if there's a way you can give more people a similar experience. I guess maybe they can all just join the military, but I don't know. People talk about gap years. I don't know how well they work at making you more serious. Maybe you just need to like work for a year out of high school, just so you become a little more serious, a little more motivated. You have an understanding of how can I be successful and do good things in the world.
If you strip away obstacles around money and other obligations, right? There's plenty of people who have to work, whether in college, to support their families, whatever. But like, just if you say, hey, we got a blank slate, everyone's on the same kind of plane, which is not how life is, but let's just say it was. And you said, like, what are the options of people to go get the seriousness or go get the experience? There is this like ascending level of severity. So on one end, maybe it's like, go get a job. Then there's like travel to other cultures, right, for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, and get exposed to a bunch of them. Then there's like, go live in another culture. And then maybe there's like, go live in another culture during a time of war, right? Or like however like that arc is. And ultimately, I think, one, most people don't do it because like it's weird. It breaks like the societal, like just go to college, like stop being weird, right? And like get your degree and go get a job. The highest end of the spectrum, usually the people who are willing to do that are not the people who have other opportunities. It's like, that's another thing, is that most people who join the military when they're young, they're not like, should I go to Harvard or should I join the infantry? Right? Like that's not like that. That's not the trade-off. And so what naturally happens is like they get pulled down on the severity curve. Harvard versus military is almost never an option. Maybe it's like Harvard versus West Point. I want to go be an officer or something, right? Harvard versus go get a job is almost maybe a tech company, but like for the most part, that's not a thing. Harvard versus like go live in another culture, again, not likely, but maybe I'll go to Harvard and I'll study abroad for a semester, right? And so like people will get some of that like weird experience, but again, it pulls in the tails of the comparison and gets you within that band.
I know this guy he's a 19-year-old, just genius kid. He's done some really impressive, like he helped me with the SBF interview, but also he's doing some really impressive things. Like the smartest 19-year-old I know. And so he took a gap year. He worked for Bern Hobart. He's like his second in command there. But now he's considering what to do next. And he's like, I think I'm going to go to college. And I'm like, dude, you have a better career now than somebody who goes to even the most elite universities will have years after they graduate. Like the amount of people who know who you are and could like get you something. But just the social aspect of college.
This is it.
Yes, because for somebody who's already mature at that age, your high school friends are just not gonna like have that level of ambition and maturity. But I was arguing you're not even gonna get that in college. Like my social life is much better now outside of college than it was in college, just because the people I hang out with are like 26, 30 kind of, older people. And I said, like, I feel like you're probably going to be similar. And I feel like a lot of these people who are going to be at the tails, I think their social life even would be better outside of college if they can find the right groups.
Yeah, well, it's intentionality versus probability, right? Like you can intentionally go create a social group or intentionally go try to break into a social group versus college. Like you ever notice that in college, everyone just hangs out with the people from their dorm? Yeah. Like, holy
or like
shit.
Who they ran into at orientation.
How much of your lifetime, like, information, like all these different things was determined by like, I don't know, like a random, lottery as to like who you got put in as your college roommate and who lived down the hall.
Yep.
Right. And so like some of it's like, hey, it doesn't matter who it was, you were going to become friends with people around you because you wanted to have a social life. But a lot of it is like, man, if you think back, like, was that the highly optimized decision? Like, probably not.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot to be the weirdo who doesn't hang out with the people, doesn't hang out with their college roommate or doesn't hang out with the people in their dorm, and instead intentionally goes and seeks out a different group of, friends that they want to spend time with because they think they can learn from or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
but no, sir, go ahead.
It's just like, that's what most people like, oh, that's a nerd, right? Like it's just even the way people talk about it, like has like a negative connotation to it, but like it shouldn't be that way.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, I heard somewhere that men mature much later than women. So when they finish their...
You can ask my wife, she will confirm that.
Yeah. But when they finish their brain development, and so you have this period when like people are 18 or 19 or something, and the women are already like, their brain development is complete, and the guys are just... like
idiots.
Yeah, exactly. So it is like a strange time even that way, where like the women are like as mature as like a guy's like when they're 25 or something, right?
Yes.
And part of that is the reason why they seek out like older people as well. But yeah, because the guys at that age are just idiots. Yeah.
If you think about, again, generalized, but like if you think of the average like 18 to 22-year-old male put into a social situation like a college party.
Yeah.
There's like an insane increase of dumb shit that they are willing to do to make people laugh, to get social status, to get approval, like to do all this stuff. And then you're like, all right, well, if you take that person out and you like put them in like the workforce, they would be just like a normal person.
Yeah.
Right. It's like some of it's just like social situation stuff, but also like, yeah, you probably did a bunch of shit when you're 18 to 22 years old that you would never do 25 or later because your brain just was developed.
Yeah.
Risk is different, right? Like all that stuff.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question.
All right, go ahead.
So how does Bitcoin increase the number of...
I thought we were going to get through the whole thing with no Bitcoin. All right, go ahead.
Well, now I'm curious about this. How does it increase the amount of goods and services in the world? So we talked about like Google Maps, for example, right? It's like, okay, they developed a virtual product. It makes economic transactions that otherwise wouldn't have been possible happen. It like saves his time. He can use that time to do other things, blah, blah, blah. All kinds of other like benefits. What is that for Bitcoin?
Well, I think the single most important piece is Bitcoin gives people back their time.
Okay.
So if you think of money, money is just time, and you work to get economic value that you then want to hold. The more economic value that you hold, the less that you have to rent out your time or spend your time to get more economic value. So think of it in terms of rich people. They have the freedom of time. They can go do what they want. They can travel. They can spend it however they want. They're not beholden to, I have to go to my 9-to-5 job and make economic value so I can pay my bills and do all this.
Yeah.
So the more money or economic value that you hold, the more time that you have in terms of free time. The reason why that's important is because today the money loses value. So if I have $100 in 1990 and I hold it for 20 years, it buys me less goods and services. So there's this constant feeling of like, I can never get ahead. It's the rat race, right? Now, 55% of American citizens invest. They have some investable asset. And so the goal is for those investable assets to outpace the devaluation of the currency. And so stock market goes up, real estate goes up, commodities, bonds, whatever, right? So I get some ability to outpace it. But 45% of Americans have no investments. They just have cash. The paycheck to paycheck, or they just have 100% of their wealth in cash. Those people have gotten worse off over the years. And then if you look in the last 2.5 years, inflation is now at 8.5, 9.1%. But that's on top of the 5 to 7% inflation from last year. Some of this compounding effect. And so while the devaluation of the currency has accelerated, wage growth hasn't kept up. So if you were getting paid $10 an hour in 2019, $10 an hour in 2020, $10 an hour in 2021, and $10 an hour in 2022, you're actually getting paid less money today than you were back in 2019. Because your purchasing power's gone down.
Right.
So what Bitcoin does is Bitcoin just simply says, if you go to work and you earn money, you can now save it and no one can devalue it.
Right. Okay. But given the volatility in its price, it sounds like you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but that it gives you like a stable way to store your like a low volatility way to like store your savings. So
It's the single most important thing for a society.
right. But given the recent volatility in the price,
There's no volatility.
okay.
The only volatility is how many dollars people are willing to give you for it. It's the exchange price that's volatile. Is the dollar volatile?
Less than Bitcoin, yeah. But
I would argue it's not. Because if I had, let's say, $10 and I wanted to go buy goods and services in 2020, January of 2020, and I showed up today and I wanted to buy $10 worth of goods and services, I could buy less, right? The dollar has devalued against those goods and services.
But couldn't you say the same thing about Bitcoin? Like if you're using that as a way to, if you're comparing them to goods and services.
Bitcoin in 2020, if I have the one Bitcoin, right? And now I try to go buy something, I can buy more goods and services with that one Bitcoin. The purchasing power of Bitcoin appreciates over time. The purchasing power of the dollar depreciates.
So it could be that it increases in value over time, but also that it's more volatile.
But it's not volatile. That's the key, is we think of volatility as an exchange rate, right? So for example, people look at the housing market. How many dollars will somebody give me for this house in 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022? But the house is not volatile. The house is a fucking house. It's got four walls, got a roof, and people still live in it. The volatility is the exchange rate to dollars. Now that's how finance is based, right? So it's not like, we shouldn't think about, exchange rates or anything like that. But when you price the home, you don't say like it's worth one home, now it's worth two homes, right? You say, no, it's worth, $100,000, it's worth $125,000, it's worth $75,000. So there's an exchange back into a common unit of account.
Okay, but if you take dollars out of it, I would just say like how many apples could you buy with one Bitcoin? That amount, again, is still an exchange rate, but even if you take the dollars out of it, even compared to goods and services, it seems more volatile than...
but it's volatile to the upside where the dollar is volatile to the downside.
Yeah, unless you bought at the peak.
Well, if you're trying to optimize on a single day-to-day basis, like basically, if you say, hey, I bought one Bitcoin today and then I try to spend it in a week, you're a day trader.
Yeah.
Right? But nobody says, oh, I got $1 12 months ago and now it's down 10% in purchasing power, right? Like the dollar is horrible and no one should use dollars.
But the 45% of people you mentioned who don't have any investments, they're probably the kind of people who don't have, who can't just hold for a long time. Like they're the kind of people who need to be liquid on a very regular basis. Like they get a paycheck, they need to use it. So for those kinds of people, how is Bitcoin a solution if you need to hold it for a long time to see that upside? Well,
the first thing is Bitcoin is a technology solution. The actual solution to most people's problems is financial education, right? So if you think about it, like the 45% of Americans, if they knew, hey, those dollars you're holding are eroding away in purchasing power and you literally are getting paid less money than you were 2 years ago, like they probably would make changes, right? Or the theory would be that if they had the education, they would make changes. The first problem is like, they just don't know that. And so like, why don't we teach that in school? Right? Like that, like better than teaching like all the bullshit. Like, why don't we just teach people, hey, the currency is created in a way where it has to be devalued and therefore do not hold this for 100% of your wealth for very long periods of time. Right? And so this also goes back to the whole thing of like, I don't think there's very many people that say like, hey, Bitcoin today is a superior means of payment and like you should go take 100% of the money you want to spend tomorrow and go put it in Bitcoin and like hope it doesn't go up or down. Right? I think instead where you're seeing a lot of adoption is actually as a store of value. So a lot of people are coming in and you see it in the data, like 60+% of Bitcoin in circulation hasn't moved in a year. Right? So people are, for majority of the Bitcoin that is held by folks, they're buying it and holding it for long periods of time.
Okay.
And so the theory, and again, takes time to see if this plays out, is that you have, as a currency, you have to establish yourself as a store of value before you can ever become a means of exchange.
Okay, but so you think eventually Bitcoin will be a medium of exchange? Or
well, let me ask you this. Do you trust computers or people?
For what, I guess, would be the question.
Well, forget for a second what you think. You trust computers over people for majority of the things in your life.
Sure.
Right? Like your music recommendations, your search results, your maps, like all these different things, right? Today, billions of people around the world put faith in 12 people at the FOMC to fucking guess the future.
Yep.
Talk about something that exists today that 100 years from now, we're going to look back and be like, what happened? there are 12 people who are not elected by the people. They're just appointed that go into a conference room and they periodically look at a bunch of data, which usually is backwards looking data. And there's a lot of problems with the data. And they lick their finger, put it in the air, and they say, we think we should do X for the future. And like, you don't have to look very far. Just look over the last 2 years. These people have no clue what's going on, right? And one of my favorite examples is like, if you asked a 5-year-old, positive or negative, talking about GDP for a quarter, it's a 50-50 shot, right? Like positive, negative. In the last 2 quarters, the economist has said positive and it came in negative, right? So like, again, I don't expect people to be like, oh, they have to always get, if it's 1.2, they have to get 1.2 right. Of course, it's hard. It's a complex machine. There's moving parts. There's tons of data that changes, whatever. And if they say 1.2 and it comes in at 1.4 or 1.0, like, okay, sure, they at least directionally got it right. But when you start to see like they think it's positive and it comes in negative, it's like, why? Like, who cares what they say next time, right? Like they have no clue. But it's not their fault. Like, I don't think there's like some grand conspiracy where they like go in a room and they're like, it'd be fucking our best strategy. Let's say positive, even though we think it's going to be negative. Like, I literally think they think it's going to be positive, and then stuff goes wrong. And so the reason why I say that is like, if automation is a very non-controversial thing, the single most important institution in your life that is human-led, that fucks up your life, is central banks. Not because they want to, but that is what happens. So why don't we automate it? Well, Bitcoin already did that. The most disciplined monetary policy over the entire COVID, inflation, recession, all this shit has been Bitcoin. It's the only one that didn't change. Everyone else changed. The Fed, they pivoted, then they went QE, then they came back, now they're doing QT. The ECB said, we're not gonna do QT. Oh, now they're doing it. We're not gonna take our interest rates from negative to zero. Like all these things, they all changed their minds.
But still, relative to goods and services, the exchange rate is less volatile for given all this volatility and how people react.
So volatility, not good or bad, works in both directions, up or down, right?
But it is bad in the sense if you just want to be able to, if you want the liquidity.
Well, it's volatility by itself is not bad. If volatility to the upside like Bitcoin,
sure,
right, is actually a good thing if you're holding Bitcoin, right? Because everything around you gets cheaper. And so if you go back to January 2020, before everything happened, and you said, knowing everything we know now, you can put your assets in one currency. You put in Bitcoin.
Do you still think that Bitcoin is a good inflation hedge? Or
I think that what we are learning, like Bitcoin served as a fantastic debasement hedge. And I think over time, like my views have evolved on this, and I think the market is just getting smarter as we get more data, which I think is a healthy thing. Inflation hedge assets are actually a very interesting thing. Inflation hedge assets move before the inflation comes, right? So like one of the things that people forget is like, if I think inflation is coming, I do not wait for the inflation to get here and then move my assets. I move them in anticipation. So this is why in Q3 and Q4 of 2020, you saw Paul Tudor Jones, Stanley Druckenmiller, like all these like Wall Street legends talking about, we think inflation is going to be high. We're going to go and we're going to put our assets in inflation hedges. Paul Tudor Jones famously said, Bitcoin's going to be the fastest horse in this bucket. Well, guess what Bitcoin did? It went from $10,000 to $64,000 in a matter of like 5 months, right? Well, that tells me that there was a fixed supply asset, tons of demand coming in. Inflation was still like 2-3%. We didn't get the first 5% CPI print until June of 2021. So Bitcoin moved before, and then here came 5+% for what is now over a year. Now, Bitcoin has also come down since November. It peaked at $69,000 in November, and it's now trading called 23,000, whatever it is. Why did it come down? Inflation's still high. Because markets are forward-looking. So just like, why did the stock market come down? It's because the Fed said we are going to destroy demand. And the second they started to say that, what did sophisticated investors do? Like, we're fucking out.
Okay, so you think the reason, one of the reasons Bitcoin declined is the prospect for inflation went down?
Not the prospect for inflation. It's that the Fed is signaling that they are going to do everything they can to create tighter financial conditions and they're going to destroy demand.
Gotcha.
And so again, it's pretty unique in that like Bitcoin hasn't been any different than other assets, right? In some way, when you have market intervention, like we have, especially over the last two and a half years, all asset correlations start to trend towards one. So Bitcoin up until 2020 was like a non-correlated asset, right? Correlations were 0.15 or whatever it was. Just it's a math equation. It's not up for debate. Like you just measure the math. In 2020 until today, correlations have gone through the roof. And now you just overlay, S&P and Bitcoin or S&P and NASDAQ or whatever, and they just trade like almost lockstep. But so do a lot of assets, because what's happened is we have a manipulated market and sophisticated investors treat all of the assets in a similar fashion, right? In March of 2020, Bitcoin's correlation to other assets went through the roof. There was a liquidity crisis. People sold everything, they wanted dollars. So if you think of it today, the dollar's at a 20-year high against, the dollar index against other fiat currencies. People want dollars. So if people want dollars, the dollar strengthens. Well, if all these other assets are priced in dollars, everything goes down. Right?
I guess if you're looking for a hedge, you probably want it to be not correlated to other assets you hold.
The problem is that there is no asset right now. Right? In these situations, like basically what we're watching. So 2020, this is like a unique I think that we're still in the middle of. So it's still a changing environment. 2020 was a very short recession. It's probably the shortest on record, in that we got 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, but it was down and right back up. And that's because of the intervention by central banks and politicians with monetary fiscal policy. But correlations went to 1, right? And so that was a liquidity crisis where people were scared. They wanted dollars. They didn't want assets. They sold them off. Everything goes. If you go back to 2008, there was a 6-month liquidity crisis where people were selling assets. Gold went down 30% in summer of 2008, right? Then government stepped in and we went back up. And by 2011, gold hit an all-time high. So liquidity crises can be like super acute and short, like they were in March of 2020 into April of 2020, or they can be 6 months, whatever. In some weird way, it's not like a acute liquidity crisis, but basically what we've been in since November, December of last year is a version of a liquidity crisis where people are saying, I don't want to have risk on because I hear the Fed. The Fed's in control. Don't fight the Fed. They're going to destroy demand. And they only are going to get more and more and more bold if inflation stays high and their actions aren't working, which is where we are. We're in this like stagflationary period. So in some weird way, everyone who's going to sell Bitcoin already has, right? Now, sure, there's day trading, there's, whatever, but all of those hedge funds, they all were selling, right? You even see Tesla, like all of the people who were looking at this as one of many assets, they sold it. They're like, hey, look, we need liquidity. We need this. We're scared. We're whatever. But like, it's 6 at $20,000, or give or take a couple $1,000s on either side. It's because you have a holder base that like, Bitcoin goes to $1,000, they're not selling, right? And so it's like this very weird asset, because the more that quantitative easing and like the debasement and all that stuff is talked about, the higher Bitcoin goes. But Bitcoin, what it appears, given now, doesn't care so much about the actual inflation as much as the anticipation of the devaluation and the inflation.
Okay.
So people move the assets before it happens. And then once it happens, like inflation's here now, right? And everyone's like, oh, why isn't Bitcoin going up? Well, it's because they're looking forward and the Fed's saying, we're going to crash everything, right? And so what ended up happening is they crashed everything.
Okay. But so does it imply you're not so worried about inflation in the future because you see the price of Bitcoin moving? Or you see that it's moved down, I guess, anticipating and pricing in the inflation in the future being brought down by the Fed. So are you less worried about inflation now than you were before?
I don't think that my expectations of inflation change based on what happens to Bitcoin's price. I think Bitcoin's price changes because of the expectations of inflation, right? Which is like a weird nuance, but it's less about like, oh, I see Bitcoin do X and therefore now I think something different about inflation. It's depending on what I think is going to happen with inflation is why Bitcoin's price moves, but really it's not because of the inflation as much as it's what is the Federal Reserve's response to that inflation movement. Mm-hmm. So a great example is we're recording this in August of 2022, and we just got the CPI print this morning. It came in at 8.5%, which is lower than the 9.1% from June. There's a lot of people who are celebrating, saying, oh my God, this is amazing. We now have inflation going down. That's not what happened. Month to month, inflation was flat. The month to month change, there was no change. It's that from June to July of last year, inflation moved upwards. And so now what we're seeing is base effect. So yes, year over year change in inflation appears to be lower, but it's not because the inflation from June to July changed. It's just because inflation was going from 3 to 5 and then eventually 7% in December of 2021. So now we're getting compounding effects. So if we get to, I'll make up numbers. Let's say that we get to December of 2022 and inflation is at 7%, which people say, well, we're at 8.5% in the July reading. If we get to 7, that means we're heading in the right direction. Yeah, but that means we compounded at 7% for 2 years.
Yeah, gotcha. You're not getting back the value you lost.
Like, holy shit. By the way, like Chipotle is not lowering their prices, right? Like no one, none of the price increases are going back.
Yep.
And so you have this like really weird thing where at the end of the day, does the number actually matter? Like, I think that's like the important question. Is there a difference between 8.5 and 9%? Well, like in the official measurements, like it's all kind of manipulated data, right? And so if you even look at the CPI basket itself, like this is, the deeper you go into this, the more you're just like, this is all fucking woo. 33% of the CPI basket is made up of something called shelter, which is estimated right now to be between 5.5% and 6% year over year increase. But rents and real estate are both up 12 or more % year over year. So what goes in the shelter bucket? Like, how is it that you're counting in the CPI official measurement 50% or less of the value of the increase in rent and real estate? Like, where else are people, if they're not renting, if they're not buying, like what else are they doing? Right? And so they created all kinds of bullshit metrics like owner equivalent rent and like all this like nonsense. But if you actually go and you read it, and probably one of the scariest things if you read the CPI methodology, the CPI rent index is determined based on 1980 census data. And they just call people, and there's like 30 or 60,000 homes that they've pre-identified based on the 1980 census data, and they rotate through them, right? So they maybe call like 10,000 every time or whatever. And they just say like, hey, what are you paying for rent? Which sounds like, okay, maybe that's the best they can do. But we have Zillow, apartment.com, Square, like they have real-time data. And I think Zillow says they have 100 million data points in real time. Well, guess what their rent index says? In the teens, right? Or apartment.com, I think is like 14%. I think Zillow was like 10% or something. Like whatever the numbers are, they're like way higher than what this is showing.
Yeah.
And so it begs the question, like, is it a data problem? Is it a methodology problem? Is it a presentation problem? Like it's probably all of it, right? But then it comes back to none of that matters because they're looking at the CPI metric. And what they're saying is we have increased interest rates and we are conducting quantitative tightening and inflation is persistently high. They're going to keep bringing the hammer until one of two things happens. Either inflation comes down or there is so much pain in the economy that they give up.
It's politically impossible. Yep.
Yeah. And I think that that's what's going to happen. I think they're going to give up. I'm not predicting what will happen, but I think that they will do it sooner than people realize because it sounds good to talk tough. Midterm elections. It's going to be real hard to go into a midterm election with the current administration saying, we know that there's high inflation and we know that we caused a recession. Vote for us.
Yeah. What do you think is going to happen in the midterms? Because bloodbath?
I don't pay attention to like individual races, or anything like that in terms of like, oh, who's going to win this or this candidate or that candidate. It's just not interesting to me. But I think that there's a pendulum swing in society where we went to one extreme with there's a bunch of different labels you could put on it, whether it's kind of the woke stuff or like whatever. Like it's just like it's very obvious like the pendulum swung one direction, and I think it's swinging back. And so just naturally, like there's a lot of people who feel that sentiment shift. I think that's why you see Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, like starting to talk a lot more about politics and they sense it. That would likely lead to, kind of this like red wave or whatever in the midterm elections. But I always go back on politics of like, presidents really can't do that much. Like, yes, they are the most powerful person in the world, but like people were really, really scared of Donald Trump. And then people on the other side of the aisle were really, really scared of Joe Biden. What have either one of them done? Like, sure, yes, you can point to specific piece of legislation or whatever, but like, what did they do that like fundamentally changed the course of, America? And sure, the extremes of both sides will point to certain things like, oh my God, can you believe they did whatever? But like, if you actually look at like structurally, there's checks and balances. Although we forget that, we like to, executive powers, like all this stuff or whatever. And so it's just really hard for politicians to like get shit done, which is also why then I think like the private market is so responsible for driving solutions, is because like the bureaucrats, the system is designed for them not to be able to do shit. Right. So we need entrepreneurs to be able to solve the problems.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's really interesting. If you think, people say that the president is really powerful, but one interesting question to ask is, what is the difference in outcomes between one person becoming president and another person becoming president? And if it's not that much, then then the question is, well, who is the person where if they didn't exist, there would be a big difference, where there's a big counterfactual difference? I think we said Elon Musk is one of those people, right? Like 1,000 years.
The best
future.
entrepreneurs.
Exactly.
It's like that is the biggest difference to society. If Jeff Bezos didn't exist, you wouldn't have Amazon.
Right.
If Elon Musk didn't exist, right? Like, and I don't know how many there are. There are 5 people, or there are 50 people, or there are 500 people. There's some number, but almost all of them are not politicians. Like, I'll say private sector, but like you could say they're scientists. There's whatever, but like they're not politicians. And it goes back to how many of your smartest friends want to be politicians?
They're not my friends.
No, you're just laughing, right? Like nobody that I know is like, my smartest friends want to be politicians. Now, it's not a knock against people who want to be politicians, because actually, I hope that they are somebody's smartest friend, right? Yeah. Like actually, that's what we would want. And if you think about in ancient Rome and all, like it was a very like aspirational thing. But I think in some weird way, like meme culture has destroyed institutions, and like politicians, I mean, like there's literally Twitter accounts that are like tracking the day trades of a politician. Like it's like this is a joke. Like, you're just like us. Like, shut up.
Yeah.
And so in some weird way, you why would you go do that? If you're intelligent and you could solve real problems, you could make money, you could like do all this stuff. Like, why would you do it? And sure, there's some people who are like, oh, I believe that this is the place for change. But there's not very many people who are like, yeah, this is the place to create change.
Yeah, I think one of the things over history that matters a lot is, what do the young, talented people want to do? And what are the options for them? You'll always have people in a society that are really ambitious and smart. And these are the kinds of people who are like founder types. But throughout most of history, these people were like warlords or, military. And that was bad for society, obviously, right? Because like being a warlord is a negative-sum game. I mean, if you think of somebody like Napoleon, the guy was insanely brilliant. He was basically, today he would be like a great startup founder. Just the ability to think about, micromanage the economy, the military, the strategy, everything. Actually, there's a funny example where he tells an Austrian diplomat, listen, you're not going to win. I'm willing to lose 60,000 men a month, right? And I was thinking, that's very similar to if like the Uber CEO told the Lyft CEO, you're not going to win. I'm willing to burn $1 billion of VC capital a quarter.
Well, Jeff Bezos did this with diaper.com and many others, where he literally said, I'm just going to lose money on every diaper I sell until you sell me your business.
Right. Oh, what was that story with, can you remember the name of the Japanese investor again?
Masayoshi Son.
Masayoshi Son. Was it YouTube, or I forget the name of the company, but basically he asked them, Uber. Okay. He said, I want to give you $100 million. And they're like, we don't need $100 million. And he's like, okay, well, who are your top 5 competitors? And they give the names. And he's like, okay, either you take my money or I'll give them $100 million.
You either want my bazooka pointed at you or behind you.
Yes. So yeah, I hopefully over time, the smartest people will realize I can make a lot more impact on the world by building businesses, but building goods and services for people. The problem is like you said, if none of the smartest people are going into politics, you have a problem where the biggest impact that politics can have is preventing people from building useful goods and services, right? So if you think about nuclear is a great example of this. The FDA is it's my opinion that a lot of drugs that could have improved quality of life have just basically been prevented by the FDA's long and convoluted process. So yeah, hopefully a few of those kinds of people actually just like make sure that things can pass through the bureaucratic filter. But
You want to hear a crazy idea?
go for it.
One of the fastest paths to being a celebrity in today's society is for a young person to become a politician.
Like AOC or something. Yeah.
Right? Like they're celebrity politicians now.
Yeah.
And look, by the way, I'm always very clear, like Donald Trump was one, AOC was one, right? And so just like if you have congressperson or senator in front of your name, the press will write about you. Like you have a fast track to celebrity. And so the like TikTok social media generation, there's a lot of those people are going to go try to be politicians.
Yeah.
Right? Because it is a path to doing it. Now, it's not all of them, but like the incentives are weird.
Yeah. I do wonder if, like, I guess I don't have like a good sample of people my age, but I do wonder how many of them are thinking of the world in terms of, I want to go into politics and make like political change. The thing is, in public education, the stories you're told are like who impact stories. You don't hear of Borlaug or Haber or, all these great scientists who have like allowed billions of people to live. You hear about, like activist movements. These movements have been important, no doubt, right? But if that's your only conception of history, that basically we give people more rights and that's the only thing that's changed about history, that's our progress is, that's a very incomplete picture of history. And obviously that reinforces what people think is important to do with their careers, right? Like if that's what you think, you're going to want to become a politician or something.
Yeah. Well, and also why become a politician if you can affect more change in the private market?
Right.
Like we celebratize Bezos and Musk and, name all these people because they're actually the ones that create change.
Yeah.
Like Elon Musk and SpaceX did something that the US government could not do.
For way cheaper and with less time. Yep. It's insane.
Right. And so like, okay, Anduril is doing something that the US military could not do.
Right. Yeah.
And by the way, like that's a good thing that we have people who are able to get capital, use their ideas and like provide these capabilities. Like it is a good thing that SpaceX can bring us to space. It is a good thing that Anduril can help protect the United States of America, right? And so like for the average American, like we don't give a shit who does it. I just need somebody to make sure that like things are good, right? Mm-hmm. But if the government can't do it, then like we should be really fucking happy that there's other solutions out there.
Yeah, and then the positives, the white pill on this is, if you look at the media, they're always complaining about like people like Musk or Bezos. But if you look at opinion polls, like Pew Research polls about what do people think about Amazon, what do people think about Musk, they're actually like pretty overwhelmingly positive, which means that people understand that you use Amazon every day, right? Like you understand like this guy basically is getting you shit for very low cost, very immediately. I'm hoping that the media narrative, these people are actually just basically competitors. If you think about like New York Times, it's a competitor to Facebook, it's a competitor to Google. So obviously they're going to have a negative spin. Hopefully that doesn't.
Well, they're also a competitor to the entrepreneurs because the entrepreneurs are able to basically expose the bullshit.
Yeah.
Jeff Bezos in the middle of the pandemic hired 100,000 people.
Yep.
Right? The average pay of an Amazon worker is over $15 an hour. It's like $17 an hour. So how is it that Jeff Bezos was able to get it to $17 an hour, but politicians can't even do it in their own states, let alone at the federal level?
Right.
Like I always joke, like, why are the politicians undershooting so much? Why do they only want $15 an hour? Amazon already pays $17. Why don't you make it $17?
Yeah. I mean, over time, the thing that drives up wages is higher worker productivity, which is made possible by innovations that, make you a more efficient worker. It's like the people overhype, there's also this narrative of, like the reason we have better working conditions today than we did in the past, or we work fewer days and fewer hours is because of labor market regulations. People say like, unions brought us weekends off or stuff. I think the real story is just that like workers are just so much more productive today that it makes sense for companies to hire them for more money. If you get more money, you're willing to work. If you're willing to bargain for weekends off or stuff like that. And yeah, so I think labor market regulations have had very little to do with improvements in worker conditions over time. I think it's basically been the free market has just made workers more efficient, and therefore it's good for workers.
Yeah, 100% agree.
Yeah.
Let's wrap up.
Yeah.
Where can we send people to find you on the internet?
Yes. So I have a podcast called The Lunar Society. I have intellectuals, scientists, founders come on, and I really like to learn a lot about their discipline, ask them really nuanced, interesting, deep questions. I've had Sam Bankman-Fried, David Deutsch, Tyler Cowen, those kinds of people on.
A very wide variety of
Yes.
folks, and also very kind of deep, intelligent conversations with them.
Yeah, thank you. And
Where can people find it?
yes, it's called The Lunar Society. It can be found everywhere. Fine podcasts are sold. No, it's free. And so Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube. There's a video version on YouTube, so that you can find that there. And we've been talking about some of my blog posts. Those you can find on my Substack, dwarkeshpatel.com. Difficult name, but if you look at the description, you'll see how to spell my name. So just go to dwarkeshpatel.com. And yeah, I'm Dwarkesh_SP on Twitter. But the Lunar Society podcast is my main thing. So I'm just going to speak slowly because I tend to speak fast. The Lunar Society. Yep.
We'll link to it in the description. I enjoy it, so I appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
And anyone who hasn't yet, I highly suggest go check out the podcast or follow you on Twitter as well.
Yeah, man. Well, dude, I really appreciate you having me on. I really enjoy your content, so I was super grateful to be able to come on.
We only went for 3 hours or so.
Yeah, I didn't feel that long at all.
All right, we'll definitely do it again in the future.
Yeah, man. Awesome.